Back in 1985, firefighters in Brooklyn were fighting fierce flames that were shooting up from a Cadillac sitting in Prospect Park. The bitter smoke twisted up into the dark sky, bringing with it the strong odors of gasoline, burning rubber, and something much more terrifying. When they finally put out the fire and forced open the trunk, they found exactly what they had been dreading. Inside was a body, burned beyond recognition and shot in the back of the head like an execution. The dead man was Anthony Stabile, someone whose name would become famous in movie history 5 years after this moment, made legendary in Martin Scorsese's incredible film, Goodfellas. But the real Anthony Stabile, the actual flesh and blood criminal who lived his life, fell in love, committed robberies, and met his end in the dark corners of New York's criminal underworld, has been mostly erased from memory. His true story lies hidden under many years of mob secrets and Hollywood fantasy. This is his story. This is the real truth about the man who worked alongside Henry Hill, survived the fear and suspicion that gripped the gang in the years following the Lufanza robbery, and in the end became a victim of the same criminal world he had dedicated his entire existence to. It's a tale of friendship and backstabbing, of close bonds and cold-blooded killing, of the American dream gone horribly wrong and turned into something evil and frightening. But before we get into Anthony's world, I want to know something. Where are you watching this from right now? Write down your city and what time it is in the comments section below. And if you're prepared for the most detailed and complete gangster story you're going to hear tonight, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and smash that like button hard. Believe me, you absolutely don't want to miss what's about to come next. The neighborhood streets of Sunnyside, Queens, during the early part of the 20th century, were like their own separate universe. A location where Italian immigrant families built their lives in the enormous, shadow cast by Manhattan's shining skyscrapers. It was in this place, on December 27, 1944, that Anthony Stabile came into this world. A birth date wrapped in the intentional confusion and secrecy that defined existence in organized criminal life. With very few official records available, reflecting how secretive the mob chose to be, the Stabile family had come to America just like countless millions of other immigrants, searching for better opportunities in a country that made big promises about streets covered in gold. What they actually discovered instead was a city carved up by invisible walls and boundaries, where real power belonged only to those people willing to grab it through violence, where staying alive meant learning the secret rules of the street that nobody wrote down, and where organized crime presented a way to climb out of terrible poverty that no honest job could ever provide. Anthony's father worked incredibly long hours doing construction work, his hands covered in hard calluses and his back permanently bent over from so many years of exhausting physical labor. His mother took care of their household with fierce Italian pride, preparing meals that brought back memories of the homeland they had abandoned, filling up their tiny, cramped apartment with the wonderful smells of tomato sauce, garlic, and freshly baked bread. For many families, this should have been sufficient. For numerous families, it actually was enough. But for Anthony and his brother Thomas Ronaldo Stabile, who despite being the younger brother, showed early signs of being clever and capable, the legitimate, honest path held absolutely no attraction whatsoever. They observed the neighborhood wise guys closely, the men wearing expensive sharp suits who drove brand new automobiles, who never appeared to have actual jobs, yet always possessed plenty of money, who received instant respect wherever they traveled. These particular men represented something their father's honest hard work never could possibly provide: real power, high prestige, and the freedom to live their lives exactly on their own terms. The Stabile brothers weren't unusual or unique in thinking this way. Throughout all the Italian neighborhoods spread across New York, East Harlem, Little Italy, Bensonhurst, Ozone Park, young men everywhere were making this exact same calculation in their minds. The mob offered what America constantly promised, but almost never actually delivered: genuine wealth, real respect, and membership in something much bigger and more important than just yourself. It was an attractive lie, wrapped up in just enough actual truth to become completely irresistible. Thomas Stabile, the younger of the two brothers, demonstrated early promise and intelligence. He was clever, careful in his thinking, and blessed with the sort of natural ability to lead that attracted the attention of the neighborhood crime bosses. While Anthony was more reckless and impulsive, more ready and willing to get his hands dirty with the actual work. Thomas grasped and understood the critical importance of careful strategy, of constructing strong relationships, of recognizing precisely when to take action and when to hold back and wait patiently. This fundamental difference between them would come to define their individual careers in the criminal underworld. Thomas would eventually climb up through the ranks of the Lucchese crime family, ultimately becoming a caporagime, which meant a captain who commanded his very own crew of criminals and reported directly to the family's top leadership hierarchy. It was a position of genuine substantial power, one that brought with it considerable wealth, strong influence, and the particular kind of respect that made other men physically step aside when you came walking down the street. Anthony, in direct contrast, would never manage to rise quite that high in the organization. His loyalty was absolutely unquestionable, never in doubt for a single moment. His willingness to do whatever needed to be done was never questioned by anyone, but he simply lacked the political instincts and social skills necessary to climb into the family's highest positions of power. He would spend his entire criminal career as a soldier, a working gangster who followed and carried out orders rather than being the one giving them, who earned substantial money but never actually controlled anything, who served loyally but never commanded anyone. Yet in those early beginning days, such distinctions and differences seemed far away and relatively unimportant. During the 1950s and 1960s, as New York's organized crime families were solidifying and strengthening their iron grip on industries like trucking companies and airports in the era after Prohibition ended, the Stabile brothers were learning their criminal trade, making their important connections, and getting ready and prepared for the lives that were waiting for them in the future. To properly understand Anthony Stabile's place and position in this world, you must first understand the organizational structure into which he was born and raised. By the time Anthony reached adulthood and came of age, New York's organized crime landscape had been formalized and structured into what eventually became known as the Five Families, a power-sharing arrangement and agreement that brought order and structure to what had previously been complete chaos and constant warfare. The structure emerged and developed from actual bloodshed and violence. In 1930 and 1931, New York's Italian mobsters engaged in brutal fighting during the Castellamarese War, a vicious and bloody conflict between Old World Sicilian traditionalists led by Salvatore Maranzano and the more Americanized faction headed by Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria. When all the smoke finally cleared and both bosses lay dead, victims of the very same men who had served under them, the survivors who remained established a brand new order. Charles Lucky Luciano, the forward-thinking visionary who had orchestrated and planned both murders, understood clearly that endless constant warfare was extremely bad for business operations and profits. He proposed creating the Commission, a governing body made up of the bosses of New York's major crime families. together with representatives from Chicago and Buffalo. This commission would mediate and settle disputes between families, authorize major criminal actions, and maintain the boundaries and territories that kept each family operating in its respective area. The 5 families that emerged and developed were the Luciano family, which would later become known as the Genovese family, the Profaci family, later called the Colombo family, the Mangano family, later known as the Gambino family, the Bonanno family, and the Gagliano family, later called the Lucchese family. Each individual family controlled specific criminal rackets and territories, though these boundaries were flexible and fluid and often overlapped in actual practice. The Lucchese family, which would become Anthony Stable's primary association and connection, had been established and founded under Gaetano Tommy Gagliano following the Castellamarese War. Gagliano was a practical pragmatist who understood fully the tremendous value of maintaining a low profile and staying out of sight. He operated and ran his criminal operations quietly, carefully avoiding the newspapers and law enforcement attention that constantly plagued more flashy and flamboyant bosses. When Gagliano passed away and died in 1951, his longtime underboss, Tommy Three-Finger Brown Lucchese, took complete control, and the family adopted and took his name. Under Lucchese's experienced leadership, the family flourished and prospered tremendously. They controlled significant major portions of the garment district, the trucking industry, and the labor unions that gave them enormous leverage and power over legitimate businesses. Most importantly for men like Anthony Stable, they controlled substantial and significant operations at Idlewild Airport, which was later renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport. The airport was an absolute gold mine of criminal opportunity. Cargo planes arrived every single day, carrying absolutely everything from expensive jewelry to cash money to valuable electronics, high-value goods that could be hijacked and stolen with minimal risk compared to dangerous armed robbery or risky drug trafficking. The Lucchese family, working in loose cooperation and coordination with the Gambino family, had infiltrated and penetrated the airport's operations at absolutely every single level, from loading dock workers to security personnel to truck drivers who transported the cargo. It was a carefully constructed and well-organized system that generated millions upon millions in completely untraceable income. But Anthony Stable occupied and held an unusual and uncommon position in this criminal world. While his brother Thomas was a made member, meaning officially inducted into the Lucchese family and deeply bound to the organization through sacred ceremony, Anthony was primarily an associate of the Lucchese family, working closely under Paul Vario's crew while simultaneously maintaining loose connections to the Gambino family through overlapping criminal operations. This particular arrangement wasn't uncommon or unusual. Despite the formal rigid structure of the 5 families, practical reality often meant that mobsters worked across family lines, especially when specific operations and criminal activities required specialized skills or when territory overlapped between families. The airport crews were particularly fluid and flexible, with members of multiple different families working together under an uneasy but generally functional arrangement. Still, this distinction mattered greatly and had serious consequences. Made members enjoyed protection from other families under commission rules. Killing a made man without proper commission approval was strictly forbidden and could trigger a devastating war between families. Associates, no matter how valuable or useful they were, enjoyed absolutely no such protection whatsoever. They could be killed with complete impunity, sacrificed whenever it became necessary, discarded and thrown away when they became a liability or problem. Anthony Stabile was in the outer circle of the mob. Connected but not officially made, he had access to opportunities. He had earning power and the ability to make money. He had the respect that came naturally from working for powerful men like Paul Vario. But he absolutely did not have the ultimate protection that formal official membership would have provided to him. This vulnerability and exposure would eventually prove fatal and deadly. But in the glory years of the 1960s and 1970s, when everything seemed possible, such concerns and worries seemed remote, distant, and theoretical. The structure and organization of each family followed a rigid and inflexible hierarchy. At the very top sat the boss, the ultimate authority who made all final decisions on all major matters and issues. Below him was positioned the underboss, the second in command who would typically ascend and rise to boss when the current leader either died or went to prison. The consigliere served as advisor and counselor, helping to mediate and settle disputes within the family organization. Below this upper administration came the caporegons, the captains who commanded and controlled their own crews of criminals. Each crew consisted of soldiers, who were made members, and associates, who were connected individuals who worked for the family, but were not formally inducted through the secret ceremony. Anthony's brother Thomas was a caporegime, a captain. Anthony himself was somewhere between soldier and associate. His exact precise status, depending on which family you asked, and which specific operations he was working on at any given time. This world operated by rules, ancient and inviolable. The most sacred and important was omerta, the code of absolute silence, no matter what happened, no matter what you personally saw or did yourself. You never ever spoke to law enforcement under any circumstances. Betraying the family was the ultimate sin, punishable by certain death, and dishonor that would extend to your entire bloodline and descendants. Other rules governed and controlled daily life in the mob. Made members could not kill other made members without explicit permission from above. Wives and children were completely off limits and could not be touched. You weren't supposed to sell drugs officially, though this particular rule was increasingly ignored as time went on. You kicked up a percentage of all your earnings to your captain, who then kicked up his share to the boss. You showed proper respect to your superiors, and expected respect in return from those positioned below you. It was essentially a feudal system transplanted directly to 20th century American archaic. Ancient and brutal, but undeniably effective for what it accomplished. For decades upon decades, it allowed organized crime to flourish and prosper with minimal interference from law enforcement, generating billions in illegal revenue while maintaining a veneer, a surface appearance of order and honor. Anthony Stabile understood this world intimately and completely. He knew exactly how to navigate its complex hierarchies, precisely when to speak and when to remain absolutely silent, how to show proper respect without appearing weak or submissive, how to be ruthless and brutal without being reckless and stupid. These essential skills had been learned and absorbed over years of apprenticeship, watching carefully and learning from men who had completely mastered the art of the organized criminal life. But understanding the rules and actually living by them were two completely different things. And as Anthony would eventually discover to his horror, the code of honor that supposedly governed this world was more myth and fantasy than reality, a comforting fiction that dissolved and disappeared the moment it became inconvenient for those in power. John F. Kennedy International Airport was far more than just a transportation hub for travelers. It was the absolute crown jewel of New York's organized crime operations, a place where millions and millions of dollars in valuable goods passed through every single day. where security was surprisingly lax and weak, and where having the right connections could turn air cargo into completely untraceable cash almost overnight. For Anthony Stabile, the airport represented golden opportunity. He became an integral part of what was known as the airport crew, a loosely organized group of hijackers, thieves, and corrupt employees who worked under the protection and authority of the Lucchese family, with operations coordinated and supervised by Capo Paul Vario, who ran his criminal empire from a pizzeria located in Brooklyn. The core members of this particular crew would later become famous and well known through the book Wise Guy and the film Goodfellas. There was Jimmy the Gent Burke, the Irish-American criminal mastermind who couldn't be officially made because of his heritage and ancestry, but who commanded respect that rivaled any boss. There was Henry Hill, the half-Irish, half-Sicilian hustler who would later betray absolutely everyone. And there was Tommy DeSimone, the psychopathic enforcer whose hair-trigger temper made him both extremely valuable and extremely dangerous at the same time. These men were Anthony Stabile's brothers, his crew, his family in the truest and deepest sense that the word had meaning in their world. They worked together on criminal operations, drank together socially, committed serious crimes together. They attended each other's weddings and celebrations, celebrated each other's successes and victories, and covered for each other's mistakes and errors. The bonds formed in this crew were supposed to be unbreakable, forged through mutual risk and mutual reward. The airport operations worked with beautiful simplicity and efficiency. Corrupt workers positioned on the loading docks would provide valuable information about particularly valuable shipments coming through jewelry, electronics, designer clothes, cash. The crew would plan the hijacking with military precision and detail, determining the best location to intercept the truck, the best time to strike and make the move, the best method to move the stolen goods quickly into the underground black market. The actual hijackings were surprisingly peaceful affairs most of the time. Drivers were rarely seriously hurt or injured. There was no percentage, no benefit in unnecessary violence, which only brought additional unwanted heat and attention from the police. A gun pointed at the head, a few threats delivered convincingly, and most drivers were happy and willing to cooperate fully, knowing that their employer's insurance would cover the financial loss. The drivers would report the truck stolen to police, provide vague and unhelpful descriptions of their attackers, and everyone went home healthy and alive. The stolen goods would disappear rapidly into a well-established network of fences. Black market dealers and legitimate businesses looking to save money by buying merchandise of questionable origin. A shipment of designer dresses worth $500,000 at wholesale prices might be sold for $100,000 in cash, split among the crew members and kicked up the chain of command. It was essentially money for nothing, relatively low risk and extremely high reward. Anthony excelled tremendously at this type of work. He was reliable and consistent, cool under intense pressure, and smart enough to recognize and know when a particular job was too hot to touch and should be avoided. He built strong relationships with the airport workers, who provided the crucial intelligence that made the hijackings possible in the first place, cultivating a network of informants who knew they could trust him completely to keep their involvement totally secret. But the airport crew's operations extended far beyond simple hijacking activities. They had their hands deep in absolutely everything. There were extortion rackets targeting legitimate trucking companies. There were loan sharking operations that preyed on gambling addicts and desperate businessmen. There were bookmaking operations that took bets on everything from football games to horse races. Money flowed in absolutely astonishing quantities on a good productive month. A soldier like Anthony might clear $50,000 or even more. This was during an era when the average American worker earned perhaps only $10,000 for an entire year. It was generational wealth being made practically overnight, and it came with all the trappings and luxuries: expensive cars, tailored custom suits, nights at the finest restaurants, and the particular kind of respect that only money and fear can buy together. The crew operated primarily out of Robert's Lounge, a bar located in Queens that served as their headquarters and social club. Here, important deals were made and finalized. Plans were hatched and developed, and the spoils of their crimes were divided up and distributed. It was at Robert's Lounge that Anthony Stabile spent countless hours drinking, gambling, and bonding with men who would later die violently, becoming victims of the very same world they had helped create and build. Jimmy Burke ran the crew with an iron fist wrapped carefully in charm and charisma. He was a criminal genius, a man who could plan a complex heist with the precision of a military operation, while simultaneously maintaining the personal relationships that kept everyone loyal and committed. He was also, as events would later prove beyond any doubt, utterly ruthless when his own survival was at stake. But in the good years, before the betrayals and murders began, before everything fell apart, Jimmy was the kind of boss who took care of his people, who made absolutely sure everyone ate well, who commanded loyalty through a powerful combination of generosity and fear. Henry Hill was the hustler, the deal maker, a guy who knew absolutely everyone and could make absolutely anything happen. He was likable in a way that Jimmy wasn't more accessible and friendly, more willing to bend the rules for friendship's sake. Henry's problem was that he talked too much, trusted too easily, and would eventually put his own survival above loyalty, which was the ultimate sin in their world. Tommy DeSimone was the enforcer, the man you sent when violence was absolutely required and necessary. He was fearless, brutal, and completely unpredictable in his behavior. Tommy's reputation for casual violence made him valuable because people were terrified of him. But it also made him a serious liability. He killed on impulse without proper authorization, creating problems that the family would eventually have to solve. Into this volatile and dangerous mix came Anthony Stabile, the reliable soldier who did his job without complaint or drama, who understood that loyalty meant keeping your mouth shut and following orders exactly, who wanted nothing more than to earn money, to be respected, and to die peacefully in his bed many years later. Surrounded by grandchildren, it was a modest dream, but in their particular world, it was also the most impossible dream imaginable. The airport crew in its absolute prime was unstoppable. They had the connections, the nerve and courage, and the protection to operate with near impunity. The police knew they were behind the hijackings, but proving it was nearly impossible. Drivers refused to identify their attackers. Goods disappeared into an underground market that left absolutely no paper trail, and the few witnesses who might have talked knew better than to cross the mob. For Anthony Stabile, these were the glory years, the best times. The money was good and flowing freely. The risks were manageable, and the future seemed secure and promising. He had a family, though whether he actually married and had children remains unclear from the historical record available. And he had his crew, which was family in a way that blood relations could never possibly match or equal. But even then, in the absolute height of their power, the seeds of destruction were being planted. The narcotics trade was beckoning, promising profits that made airport hijacking look like pocket change in comparison. Paul Vario had strictly forbidden his crew from dealing drugs, understanding that federal drug charges came with mandatory sentences that made witnesses. far more likely to cooperate with authorities. But the money was simply too good to resist and ignore. And one by one, the crew members began to involve themselves in what would become their ultimate downfall. Among all the relationships that defined Anthony Stable's life in the mob, none was more significant or more tragic than his friendship with Henry Hill. They were cut from similar cloth, both men who loved the life, who thrived on the action and excitement, who believed in the myth of honor among thieves, even as reality repeatedly proved otherwise again and again. Henry Hill had grown up in the same Brooklyn neighborhoods, watching the same exact wise guys, dreaming the same dreams. He had started young, cutting school to hang around the cab stand where Paul Vario and his crew held court, running errands, proving himself useful, working his way gradually into the family's trust and confidence. By the time he met Anthony Stable, Henry was already well established as a valuable earner and trusted associate. The famous bamboo lounge scene from Goodfellas, where Henry's camera-following narration introduces the crew to the audience, is as close as Hollywood ever came to capturing the reality of those years. There was Jimmy and Tommy and me, Henry says in voiceover, and then the camera finds Anthony Stable sitting at a table, looking up with a kind of guarded expression that comes from a lifetime of watching carefully what you say. And there was Anthony Stable, 5 simple words that sum up an entire life. Anthony was there, present, part of the inner circle, but never the center of attention. He was a supporting player in other people's stories, reliable and competent, but lacking the charisma or ruthlessness that makes legends. In the movie, Frank Adonis plays Anthony with quiet dignity, giving the character a weight that the brief screen time doesn't quite justify or support. It's a memorial of sorts, a moment of screen immortality for a man who lived and died in the shadows. The friendship between Anthony and Henry was based on mutual respect and shared experience. They were both men who understood the rules of their world, who knew how to keep their mouths shut, who could be trusted with important work. But more than that, they genuinely liked each other, enjoying the camaraderie that came from shared danger and shared success. One of the stories that survived speaks directly to the depth of their friendship. Henry Hill was having an affair, one of many extramarital relationships, and needed help keeping it from his wife Corinne. Anthony Stable stepped in without hesitation, providing alibis, covering for Henry's absences, helping to maintain the elaborate deception that such affairs required. It was a small thing perhaps, but in their world, loyalty in personal matters was just as important as loyalty in criminal ones. This kind of brotherhood extended throughout the entire crew. They attended each other's children's baptisms and confirmations, loaned each other money when times were tight, celebrated together when a job went well, and commiserated together when law enforcement got too close. It should have been enough to hold them together, this web of mutual obligation and genuine affection. But money has a way of corrupting even the strongest bonds. And drugs, the very trade that Paul Vario had forbidden, would ultimately prove more powerful than loyalty, friendship, or honor. The descent into narcotics began gradually. Almost accidentally at first, someone would know someone who could move weight, who had connections to suppliers, who needed reliable distributors. The profits were astronomical and mind-boggling. $100,000 from a single transaction, with more where that came from. It was too tempting to resist, too lucrative to pass up, even if it meant violating direct orders and risking everything they had built. Henry Hill dove headlong into the drug trade, using his prison connections from an earlier stint behind bars to establish supply lines from Pittsburgh. Anthony Stable was drawn in as well, along with Tommy DeSimone, and eventually even Jimmy Burke himself. They were careful, or so they thought, conducting their business away from Robert's lounge, using coded language, keeping the operation compartmentalized, but they were kidding themselves. Paul Vario knew. He always knew everything that happened in his territory, and while he tolerated it for a time, understanding that prohibition was impossible to enforce, he also understood that it put absolutely everyone at risk. Federal drug charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that made even the toughest gangster consider cooperation. And the money being made was so vast that it could corrupt the loyalty that held the entire organization together. Anthony and Henry's friendship deepened during these years. They were partners in multiple crimes, sharing risk and reward, trusting each other with their freedom and their lives. They spent countless hours together at the Bamboo Lounge and Robert's Lounge, drinking, gambling, discussing their latest scores. Their wives knew each other, their children played together. It was as close to a normal friendship as two gangsters could possibly have. Neither man could have imagined how it would end. Neither could have predicted that Henry, faced with the prospect of spending decades in prison, would choose survival over loyalty, would violate omerta so completely that it would bring down the entire crew. And neither could have imagined that this betrayal would ultimately lead to Anthony's death, his body found burning in the trunk of his own car. But that was all yet to come. In the good years, before the Lufanza heist and Henry's betrayal, before the murders and the paranoia, Anthony Stabile and Henry Hill were brothers, bound together by shared experience and mutual trust, living the life they had always dreamed of, never realizing that they were building a house of cards that the slightest breeze would scatter. The romantic image of the gangster sharp-dressed men conducting business over wine in expensive restaurants, moving through society with effortless confidence, contains a grain of truth. But the reality of Anthony Stabile's daily life was far more mundane and considerably more brutal. Being a mobster was, in many ways, simply a job. It required getting up each day, meeting with your crew, discussing potential opportunities, planning operations, and executing them with professional precision. The difference was that the office was a social club or a bar. The business meetings were often conducted in the backs of cars or in remote locations where surveillance was unlikely. And the work product was theft, extortion, and occasionally violence. A typical day for Anthony might begin with a phone call, never from his home phone, always from a payphone, using coded language that meant nothing to anyone listening, but everything to the participants. He would drive to Robert's Lounge or another meeting spot where Jimmy Burke would lay out potential jobs. There was always work to be done, always money to be made. The airport operations continued to be the bread and butter. Intelligence would come in about a valuable shipment, and the crew would plan the hijacking with meticulous attention to detail. They would study the route the truck would take, identify the best location for the intercept, determine how many men were needed, decide who would drive the getaway vehicles, and plan the disposal of the stolen goods. These operations generated steady income, but they were only part of a larger portfolio of criminal activity. Anthony was involved in loan sharking, lending money at usurious interest rates to gamblers and desperate businessmen, and collecting through threats or actual violence when payments weren't made on time. He had a piece of various bookmaking operations, taking bets on sports events and horses, paying out winners and collecting from losers. The extortion rackets were particularly lucrative. Legitimate businesses in the crew's territory paid protection money, not protection from outside criminals, but protection from the very men collecting the payments. A trucking company might pay $5,000 a month to ensure their trucks weren't hijacked, their drivers weren't beaten, Their tires weren't slashed. It was a simple arrangement. Pay us or suffer the consequences. But it wasn't all business. The social aspect of mob life was equally important. Gangsters spent enormous amounts of time together, not just planning crimes, but simply hanging out. They ate together at favorite restaurants where meals were always on the arm, meaning free, because restaurant owners knew better than to charge. They attended boxing matches, horse races, and Broadway shows. They celebrated holidays together, attended weddings and funerals together, mourned each other's losses, and celebrated each other's victories. This constant togetherness served multiple purposes. It reinforced loyalty through shared experience. It allowed senior members to evaluate younger associates, watching how they handled themselves under pressure, how they treated civilians, whether they could be trusted. It also provided a form of surveillance. If you were always with the crew, you couldn't be meeting with FBI agents or informing on your associates. The money Anthony earned was substantial, but not unlimited. He had to kick up a portion of everything he made to Paul Vario, who in turn kicked up to the family's upper administration. This tribute was mandatory and non-negotiable. Failure to pay could result in anything from a beating to death, depending on the circumstances and the mood of your superiors. What was left after the tribute provided a comfortable lifestyle, but not the vast wealth that Hollywood might suggest. Anthony dressed well-expensive suits, polished shoes, jewelry that announced his status because appearance mattered in their world. He drove a nice car, ate at good restaurants, gambled heavily. But he wasn't living like a millionaire. Few mobsters did, despite the enormous sums that flowed through their hands. The violence, when it came, was usually quick and professional. A beating to send a message to a slow-paying borrower. A murder, though these were rarer than movies suggest, carried out with practiced efficiency. Anthony was not primarily an enforcer, but he had participated in violence when required. In their world, the willingness to use force was a prerequisite for respect. One incident would later become infamous through Goodfellas, the shooting of Michael "Spider" Junko, a young bartender at Robert's Lounge. Anthony was present for both incidents. The first when Tommy DeSimone drunkenly shot Spider in the foot during a card game, and the second weeks later when DeSimone killed the boy for talking back. The first shooting happened almost accidentally, a product of DeSimone's notorious temper and too much alcohol. Spider had annoyed Tommy in some minor way, and Tommy's response was to pull out his gun and shoot the kid in the foot. The crew was horrified, not because violence offended them, but because Spider was useful and shooting him was stupid and unnecessary. Anthony drove the wounded Spider to a doctor they had on payroll, a medical professional willing to treat gunshot wounds without reporting them to authorities. Spider survived, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his short life. The incident should have ended there, but Tommy's pride had been wounded when Jimmy Burke criticized the shooting. Weeks later, during another card game at Robert's Lounge, Spider made the fatal mistake of talking back to DeSimone, perhaps emboldened by the crew's earlier defense of him, perhaps simply tired of being bullied. Spider told Tommy to go fuck himself. The room went silent. Everyone present knew what was about to happen, could see it in Tommy's eyes, but no one could stop it. DeSimone stood up, pulled his gun, and shot Spider multiple times, killing him instantly. The crew sat in stunned silence for a moment, then sprang into action. They couldn't call the police, obviously. Spider's body had to disappear completely, which meant wrapping him up, digging a hole somewhere remote, and burying him where he would never be found. Anthony Stabile witnessed this murder, helped dispose of the body, and never said a word about it to anyone outside the crew. This was omerta in action, the code of silence that protected murderers and made prosecuting organized crime nearly impossible. No matter how horrified he might have been by the casual killing of a 16-year-old boy, no matter how senseless the violence, Anthony kept his mouth shut. Speaking to authorities was unthinkable, a betrayal that would result in his own death. This incident illustrated the fundamental darkness at the heart of mob life. These were not honorable men engaged in victimless crimes. They were violent criminals who killed for reasons as trivial as wounded pride, who disposed of bodies like garbage, who lived by a code that protected monsters and punished witnesses. Yet Anthony continued in this life, continued to participate, continued to earn and to pay tribute and to keep his mouth shut. He had made his choice years earlier, and there was no way out. The mob was not a career you quit. It was a life sentence. And the only way out was death or incarceration. The daily business of being a gangster also meant living with constant anxiety. Law enforcement was always watching, always building cases, always looking for the weak link that would crack open an investigation. FBI agents followed crew members, photographed them at restaurants and social clubs, tapped their phones, and cultivated informants who might provide the evidence needed for prosecution. Anthony and his crew took elaborate precautions. They never discussed business over the phone. They met in public places where electronic surveillance was difficult. They used coded language even in face-to-face conversations. On the assumption that someone might be wearing a wire, they changed cars frequently, watching for tails, varying their routes, staying alert for any sign that law enforcement was getting too close. Despite these precautions, arrests were common. Anthony spent time in jail on various charges over the years. Though the specifics are lost to history, jail time was considered a cost of doing business, something to be endured with stoic acceptance. The important thing was not to cooperate, not to provide authorities with any information that could be used against your associates. This was the real life of a mobster, not the glamorous existence portrayed in movies, but a grinding routine of criminal activity, constant vigilance, periodic violence, and the ever-present threat of arrest or death. It was a life that aged men prematurely, that destroyed families. That led almost inevitably to prison or an early grave. But for Anthony Stabile and his crew, it was the only life they wanted, the only life they knew how to live. They were addicted to the action, to the money, to the respect that came from being feared, and they believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that they were smart enough to get away with it, tough enough to survive, and loyal enough to trust each other. They were wrong on all counts. If there was a golden age in Anthony Stabile's criminal career, it was the period from the mid-1960s through the late 1970s, a time when the airport crew was at its peak and money was flowing. Law enforcement seemed always one step behind, and the future appeared limitless. This was the era that Goodfellas captured so memorably, when being a gangster meant walking into the Copacabana nightclub through the kitchen entrance, being greeted by name by the maître d', receiving the best table in the house without a reservation. It meant respect, recognition, and a lifestyle that most Americans could only dream of. Anthony embraced this life fully. He dressed impeccably, favoring the dark suits and silk ties that announced his status. He wore jewelry, a gold watch, a pinky ring, a chain not ostentatiously, but enough to signal that he was a man of means. His shoes were always polished to a mirror shine, his hair perfectly styled. Appearance mattered in their world, a visual shorthand that communicated where you stood in the hierarchy. The crew's social life revolved around a circuit of restaurants, Nightclubs and social clubs where wise guys congregated. These weren't random choices. These were establishments owned by or connected to the mob. Places where they could eat and drink without worrying about surveillance. Where they could conduct business without fear of civilian witnesses. The Bamboo Lounge became their primary gathering spot. A restaurant and bar where the crew spent countless hours. Here, over plates of pasta and bottles of wine, they celebrated their successes, planned their next moves, and bonded in the way that men do when they've risked their lives together. The Bamboo Lounge was more than a restaurant. It was home, headquarters, and sanctuary all in one. Dinners were extravagant affairs, the best cuts of meat, the finest wines, desserts that seemed to go on forever. Meals might last for hours, with courses arriving in succession, each more elaborate than the last. And at the end, when a civilian would expect the bill, there was nothing. The meal was comped. A gift from the owner who understood that these were customers you didn't charge, men you didn't offend. The gambling was constant and heavy. Card games ran late into the night, with thousands of dollars changing hands. Anthony and his crew bet on everything. Football, basketball, horse racing, boxing. They weren't casual gamblers placing modest wagers. They were degenerate gamblers risking substantial sums, winning big and losing bigger, always chasing that next score. The women came with a lifestyle. Mistresses were common, almost expected. A made man or successful associate would have a wife at home and a comar on the side, sometimes multiple girlfriends who understood that they would never be wives, but who enjoyed the benefits that came with being attached to a successful gangster. Anthony had his own romantic entanglements, though the details remain murky. He was married, according to most sources, and had a son named Joseph who would survive him. But like many in his world, he maintained relationships outside his marriage. Relationships that required the kind of discretion and deception that became second nature. The lifestyle extended to vacations and entertainment. The crew took trips to Florida, to Las Vegas, to wherever they wanted to go. Traveling in style and living large, they attended major sporting events, sitting in prime seats that cost more than most Americans earned in a month. They saw Broadway shows, went to exclusive nightclubs, and generally lived as if money was infinite. And for a time, it seemed like it was. The hijacking operations at JFK continued to generate enormous revenue. One good score could net $100,000 or more in an afternoon, split among the crew, but still leaving each man with more money than they could easily spend. In 1967, Air France robbery exemplified the scale of their operations. While Anthony's direct involvement in this particular heist remains unclear, the historical record is frustratingly vague on many details of his specific crimes. Robbery itself demonstrated the sophistication and audacity of the airport crew's operations. Nearly $420,000 in cash and travelers' checks was taken, an enormous sum for the time, and the theft was executed with such precision that the perpetrators were never definitively identified. These were the years when Anthony Stabile could walk down the street in his neighborhood and receive nods of respect from shopkeepers and civilians who knew exactly what he was but understood that crossing him would be dangerous. Old women would ask him to intervene in disputes with neighbors, knowing that a word from Anthony carried more weight than any legal remedy. Store owners who were being extorted by unconnected criminals would seek his protection, understanding that the price of that protection was ongoing tribute, but that it was better than the alternative. This respect was intoxicating for men who had grown up poor, who had been nobody and nothing in the eyes of legitimate society. The deference shown by civilians and the fear shown by rivals was validation of their choice to enter the life. They were somebody now. They mattered. People remembered their names and stepped aside when they walked into a room. The crew's internal dynamics during these years were generally harmonious. At least on the surface, Jimmy Burke was the undisputed leader. The man whose criminal genius and force of personality held everyone together. Henry Hill was the valuable earner and social connector. Tommy DeSimone was the mad dog kept on a leash, useful for intimidation and occasional violence, but requiring constant management. And Anthony Stabile was the reliable one, the steady hand who did what needed doing without complaint or drama. He wasn't flashy like Henry, or terrifying like Tommy, or brilliant like Jimmy. He was simply dependable, which in their world was its own form of excellence. The money Anthony earned supported not just his own lifestyle, but extended family and friends who looked to him for assistance. This was expected in Italian culture. Success meant an obligation to help others in your community. Anthony would provide no-show jobs for relatives, loan money to friends who were struggling, pay for weddings and baptisms, and generally play the role of the benevolent patron. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect life, problems were accumulating. The narcotics operation that Anthony and several crew members had entered, despite Paul Vario's prohibition, was growing larger and more profitable. But it was also attracting law enforcement attention. The Drug Enforcement Administration was far more aggressive and better funded than local police. And drug charges carried federal mandatory minimum sentences that couldn't be negotiated away. Additionally, the crew's success was breeding jealousy and resentment. Other families were noticing how much money the airport crew was generating and wanted larger pieces of the action. Internal disputes over the division of proceeds from various operations created tension. And as the crew members got older and wealthier, they began to prioritize their own interests over collective loyalty. Jimmy Burke, always paranoid, was becoming increasingly suspicious of everyone around him. His natural tendency toward violence was no longer tempered by pragmatic concerns about avoiding attention. He saw threats everywhere, real and imagined, and his response was increasingly to eliminate problems through murder rather than negotiation. The seeds of destruction were germinating, invisible to those caught up in the daily pleasures and routines of mob life. Anthony, stable, comfortable, and confident, couldn't see the disaster approaching. None of them could. They believed they were invincible, that their success would continue indefinitely, that their loyalty to each other was unbreakable. They were catastrophically wrong. The decision to enter the drug trade, made individually by multiple crew members, but coordinated informally among them, would prove to be the fatal mistake that destroyed everything they had built. It was a calculated gamble that offered enormous rewards, but carried existential risks. And ultimately, those risks would prove greater than any of them imagined. Paul Vario's prohibition on drug dealing was not based on moral concerns. Vario was a career criminal who had ordered murders, sanctioned beatings, and supervised countless thefts and extortion schemes. His objection to narcotics was purely practical. Federal drug charges came with mandatory minimum sentences that gave prosecutors leverage to turn witnesses. A gangster facing 20 years for drug trafficking was far more likely to cooperate than one facing 5 years for theft. But the money from drugs dwarfed everything else. A single heroin deal could generate profits equivalent to months of hijacking operations. With less physical risk and easier execution, the profit margins were astronomical. Heroin purchased for $10,000 could be cut, repackaged, and sold for 10 times that amount on the street. Henry Hill was the first to dive deep into narcotics, using connections he had made during a brief prison stint to establish a pipeline from Pittsburgh. His supplier was a drug dealer named Paul Maze, who had access to high-quality heroin and cocaine. Henry began distributing in Queens and Brooklyn, making more money than he had ever made from hijacking. Anthony Stabile was drawn into the operation both through friendship with Henry and through his own recognition of the profit potential. His exact role remains unclear from the historical record, whether he was a major distributor or simply a peripheral participant, but he was involved. Enough that federal authorities later identified him as part of the network. Tommy DeSimone also participated, though his involvement was complicated by his growing reputation for unreliable, violent behavior. Tommy was the kind of associate who could be extremely valuable one moment and an enormous liability the next. His participation in the drug operation added another layer of risk, as his temper made him prone to exactly the kind of attention-drawing incidents that successful drug dealers needed to avoid. Even Jimmy Burke, the architect of so many successful operations, eventually became involved in the narcotics trade. This was perhaps the most significant development, as Jimmy's participation signaled that the prohibition was effectively dead. If the crew's leader was dealing drugs, then clearly the old rules no longer applied. The operation was sophisticated by the standards of the time. They used coded language in phone conversations, though law enforcement was already tapping lines and learning to decipher the codes. They conducted transactions in public places where surveillance was difficult. They used intermediaries and cutouts to insulate themselves from direct contact with street-level dealers. They collected debts with ruthless efficiency, understanding that weakness in collection would invite non-payment, but they were also increasingly reckless. The money was so good that it encouraged exactly the kind of flashy lifestyle that drew attention: expensive cars, lavish parties, high-stakes gambling. All of it created a profile that made law enforcement take notice. The FBI indeed began building cases, identifying members of the network, documenting transactions, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Anthony Stabile, conducting his drug business while continuing his hijacking operations and other criminal activities, was living on borrowed time. Every transaction was a roll of the dice. Every phone call a potential piece of evidence. Every associate a potential informant. The paranoia that characterized mob life intensified dramatically when narcotics were involved. The drug operation also created internal conflicts within the crew and with their superiors in the Lucchese family. Money that should have been kicked up to Paul Vario was instead being kept by the crew members. A violation of mob protocol that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Vario knew about the drug dealing. He had eyes and ears everywhere, and while he tolerated it for a time, his patience wasn't infinite. The lifestyle that the drug money funded was unsustainable. Anthony and the others were spending money as fast as they made it, maybe faster. The gambling losses alone could wipe out the proceeds from several successful drug deals. The expensive mistresses, the luxury cars, the extravagant dinners, it all cost money. And while the revenue stream seemed inexhaustible, it was actually precarious, dependent on continued success in an increasingly dangerous business. There were close calls, shipments that nearly got intercepted by law enforcement, associates who got arrested and had to be evaluated for their likelihood of cooperation, deals that went bad resulting in money lost and relationships strained. Each incident added stress to an already tense situation, raising blood pressure and shortening tempers. Anthony watched as the world he had known governed by rules, hierarchical, relatively stable, began to dissolve into chaos. The old ways were dying, replaced by a more feral version of organized crime, where immediate profit trumped long-term strategic thinking, where violence became the first resort rather than the last, where loyalty could be purchased and discarded as convenience dictated. But he was trapped. Having entered the drug trade, he couldn't simply quit. The other participants knew too much about him, and withdrawal would have been seen as weakness or, worse, as a prelude to cooperation with authorities. He was committed, for better or worse, to seeing the narcotics operation through to whatever end awaited. That end was approaching faster than anyone realized. In law enforcement offices across New York, prosecutors were assembling cases, connecting names and faces, documenting the network that linked Pittsburgh suppliers to New York distributors to street-level dealers. They were building RICO cases, prosecutions under the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, act that would allow them to charge entire criminal enterprises rather than individual crimes. And somewhere in Pittsburgh, a low-level drug dealer named Paul Maze was being pressured by federal agents, offered deals that would reduce his sentence in exchange for testimony, being shown evidence that made it clear his partners were willing to sacrifice him to save themselves. The loyalty that supposedly governed organized crime was revealed as myth, and Maze was learning the only real rule: save yourself. Because nobody else will, the trap was closing. Its mechanisms invisible to those caught within it, but no less deadly for being unseen. Anthony Stabile continued his daily routine, collecting drug money, planning hijackings, paying tribute to his superiors, never realizing that the life he had built was in its final days, that the choices he had made would lead inexorably to his death in the trunk of a burning car. By the late 1970s, the airport crew that had once seemed invincible was showing signs of stress. The combination of drug dealing, internal rivalries, law enforcement pressure, and personal conflicts was creating fissures that would eventually shatter the entire operation. Tommy DeSimone's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic and dangerous. His reputation for hair-trigger violence had always made him useful as an enforcer, but now it was making him a liability. The murder of Spider Junko, witnessed by Anthony and the entire crew, had been particularly troubling because it was so senseless, so unnecessary, so reflective of Tommy's complete inability to control his impulses. But Spider wasn't Tommy's only victim. He had murdered other people over the years, some on orders, but others simply because they had offended him in some trivial way. Each unauthorized killing created problems for the family, generating heat from law enforcement and requiring elaborate cover-ups to avoid arrest. The bosses were taking notice, and their patience with Tommy was wearing thin. There was also the incident with William "Billy" Batts Benvina, a made man in the Gambino family. The details would later become famous through Goodfellas, but the reality was even more brutal than the film portrayed. Batts had recently been released from prison and was celebrating at a bar when he encountered Tommy DeSimone. Batts made the fatal mistake of mocking Tommy about his earlier work as a shoe-shine boy, saying, "Go home and get your fucking shine box." Tommy's response was immediate and violent. Along with Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill, he beat Batts nearly to death, stuffed him in the trunk of a car, drove to a remote location, and finished the job when they discovered Batts was still alive. They buried the body in a location they thought was secure, never imagining that it would later be discovered and used as evidence in multiple murder prosecutions. The problem was that Batts was a made man. Killing a made man without commission approval was one of the most serious violations possible in organized crime, virtually guaranteed to result in retaliation. The Gambino family wanted satisfaction, and eventually they would get it in the form of Tommy DeSimone's own murder, a killing that would leave Anthony Stabile and the rest of the crew one, man short and deeply worried about their own security. Henry Hill's drug operation was also spiraling out of control. He was using his own product, developing a serious cocaine addiction that affected his judgment and made him increasingly paranoid and erratic. His marriage was falling apart under the strain of his infidelities and criminal lifestyle. His gambling debts were mounting. He was, in short, becoming exactly the kind of liability that Jimmy Burke couldn't tolerate. Anthony watched all of this unfold with growing concern. He was caught in a web of relationships and obligations that were becoming increasingly dangerous. His loyalty to Henry was being tested by Henry's declining reliability. His association with Tommy put him at risk if Tommy's unauthorized killings resulted in retaliation. His involvement in the drug trade made him vulnerable to federal prosecution. The relationship between Jimmy Burke and Paul Vario was also deteriorating. Burke was generating enormous revenue, but was increasingly resistant to sharing appropriate percentages with Vario and the Lucchese family hierarchy. There were disputes about territory, about operations, about respect. The collegiality that had characterized earlier years was giving way to tension and distrust. Anthony found himself in an impossible position. Someone connected to both the Gambino and Lucchese families, working with an Irish boss, Burke, who couldn't be made, partnered with an increasingly unreliable associate, Hill, and a psychopath, Desimone, involved in forbidden drug dealing while maintaining legitimate mob operations. He was exposed from multiple angles. The signs of impending disaster were everywhere for those willing to see them. FBI surveillance was intensifying. Several associates had been arrested and were facing serious charges. Informants were being developed within the organization. The old code of silence was weakening as younger gangsters, facing decades in prison, calculated that their own survival was more important than organizational loyalty. Paul Vario was also under pressure from his own superiors in the Lucchese family. The family's administration was demanding explanations for why so much money was being generated at the airport, but so little was being kicked up. They suspected correctly that Burke and his crew were holding back, violating the most fundamental rule of organized crime. Always share with your superiors. Anthony's brother Thomas, as a copper regime in the Lucchese family, was in a delicate position. He had to balance loyalty to his blood brother with his obligations to the family. If Anthony became a problem, if he was arrested and appeared likely to cooperate, or if he was suspected of informing, or if his drug dealing brought too much heat, Thomas might be expected to participate in his elimination. Family loyalty in the mob had very specific boundaries, and blood relations didn't always trump organizational concerns. The accumulation of these problems created a volatile mixture that needed only a spark to explode. That spark would come in December 1978 in the form of the Lufanza heist, the most audacious robbery in American history. A score so big that it would attract attention no amount of discipline could avoid, and so lucrative that it would destroy the very crew that executed it. Anthony Stabile, watching these developments with growing anxiety, understood that the good years were over. The life he had built, the relationships he had cultivated, the security he had felt, all of it was evaporating. He was a survivor by nature, someone who understood how to keep his head down and navigate dangerous situations. But what was coming would test those survival instincts to their limits and ultimately beyond them. The Lufanza heist was not Anthony Stabile's operation. This is a crucial distinction to understand when examining his story and his ultimate fate. While he was close to the men who planned and executed the robbery, while he benefited indirectly from the crew's success, while he would eventually suffer the consequences of the paranoia the heist generated. Anthony was not present on that cold December night when 6 armed men stole over $6 million from the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport. The heist was Jimmy Burke's masterpiece, planned with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of his major operations. The intelligence came from Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo agent who was deeply in debt to bookmakers connected to the crew. Werner provided detailed information about the terminal's security, the timing of cash deliveries, the location of cameras and alarms, and the procedures that guards followed. The score was bigger than anyone had imagined. The crew expected perhaps $2 million in cash and jewelry. What they found was nearly $5 million in unmarked bills and another $875,000 in jewelry and foreign currency. It was the largest cash robbery in American history at the time, a haul so enormous that it immediately attracted massive law enforcement attention. The robbery itself was executed with impressive precision. On December 11, 1978, at approximately 3:00 a.m., 6 masked men entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal. They knew exactly where to go, exactly what to do, exactly how to control the employees without triggering alarms. Within an hour, they had loaded the money and jewelry into a van and disappeared into the night. Jimmy Burke had assembled a carefully chosen crew for the operation. The participants included Tommy DeSimone, serving as one of the armed robbers, Angelo Seep, a violent thug who Burke trusted for dangerous work, and several other career criminals who understood that success depended on discipline and silence. Henry Hill, despite his closeness to Burke, was not part of the robbery crew. He was considered too unreliable, too much of a drug addict, too likely to make mistakes. Anthony Stabile, likewise, was not involved. His skills lay elsewhere in hijacking operations, in enforcing collections, in the daily grind of organized crime. The Lufthansa operation required specialists, men who could handle weapons under pressure, who could control hostages without killing them, who could execute a complex plan with split-second timing. But even though Anthony wasn't part of the robbery, he was immediately affected by it. The crew gathered at Robert's Lounge in the aftermath, celebrating the incredible score. The money was stacked in garbage bags, more cash than most of them had ever seen in one place. There was talk of how it would be divided, who would get what percentage, how much would be kicked up to Paul Vario and the Lucchese family. Anthony knew about the heist. Everyone in the crew knew, and he understood both its significance and its danger. A score this big would bring unprecedented law enforcement attention. The FBI would assign its best agents, would devote unlimited resources, would turn over every stone until someone talked. The pressure would be enormous, and under that kind of pressure, loyalty had a way of evaporating. Jimmy Burke understood this too, which is why his response to the successful heist was not celebration, but paranoia. He began implementing a plan to eliminate everyone who could connect him to the robbery. It was cold-blooded pragmatism. Dead witnesses can't testify. And Jimmy Burke, for all his criminal genius, was perfectly willing to murder his closest associates if it meant protecting himself. The first victim was Parnell Stacks Edwards, a small-time criminal who had been responsible for disposing of the van used in the robbery. Stacks had failed to complete this simple task, leaving the van parked illegally, where police quickly found it. The van contained fingerprints and other forensic evidence that could be used to identify the robbery crew. This incompetence was unforgivable, and 10 days after the heist, Tommy DeSimone shot Stacks 6 times, killing him instantly. Anthony Stabile knew Stacks, had drunk with him, had worked with him on previous operations, The casual murder of an associate for a relatively minor mistake sent a clear message. Nobody was safe. Nobody was valuable enough to be protected. Nobody's life mattered more than Jimmy Burke's freedom. The body count would continue to climb in the months ahead, each death intensifying the paranoia, each murder making the survivors more desperate to protect themselves. Anthony watched his world disintegrate, understanding that the Lufanza heist, which should have been the crew's greatest triumph, was actually their death sentence. The systematic elimination of the Lufanza crew remains one of the most chilling examples of organized crime's brutality. Over the course of roughly 2 years following the heist, Jimmy Burke ordered or carried out the murders of nearly everyone who had participated in or had knowledge of the robbery. His paranoia was not entirely irrational. The FBI was indeed building a case, but his solution was monstrous. Martin Krugman was the next to die. Krugman, a wig shop owner and bookmaker, had originally provided the intelligence that made the Lufanza heist possible, passing along information from Louis Werner about the cash storage procedures. After the heist, Krugman began demanding his share of the proceeds. Pestering Jimmy Burke with increasing desperation, Burke's response was to have him killed. Krugman disappeared in January 1979, and his body has never been found. Louis and Joanna Cafora, a married couple who had participated in the planning stages of the heist, were next. In March 1979, Louis Cafora and his wife vanished. Their bodies were later discovered, though the details remain murky. According to some accounts, they were murdered and their bodies crushed in a car compactor, a particularly horrific method of disposal that ensured no identifiable remains would surface. Anthony Stabile knew the Caforas, had spent time with them socially, and their disappearance sent another wave of fear through the crew. Tommy DeSimone himself became a victim, though his murder was unrelated to Lufanza. The Gambino family had finally settled accounts for the unauthorized killing of Billy Batts. In January 1979, Tommy was called to what he thought was his formal induction ceremony. He was finally going to become a made man in the Lucchese family, or so he believed. Instead, he was murdered, shot in the head in a classic gangland execution. His body, like so many others, was never found. Anthony Stabile attended Tommy's wake, though there was no body to mourn over. The crew gathered to honor Tommy's memory, sharing stories and drinks, maintaining the fiction that Tommy had simply disappeared rather than been murdered on the orders of men who were now accepting their condolences. The hypocrisy was stunning, but it was also standard practice in their world. Robert Frenchy McMahon, another participant in the Lufanza robbery, was found dead in July 1979. Shot multiple times in the head, Richard Eaton, who had driven one of the getaway vehicles, was murdered in December 1979. Paolo Licastri, who had helped fence some of the stolen jewelry, disappeared in 1980. Joe Manry, a small-time hood who had been connected to the operation, was killed and dismembered. Angelo Seep, one of the primary robbery crew members, was shot to death along with his girlfriend in July 1984. The murders continued for years, each one eliminating another person who could potentially testify about the heist. Anthony Stabile watched this Holocaust with growing terror. He had not been part of the Lufanza operation, but he was close enough to the crew that he knew details, had heard things, could potentially connect Jimmy Burke to the robbery if questioned by authorities. In Jimmy's increasingly paranoid worldview that made Anthony a potential threat, the FBI was indeed intensifying its investigation. Special agents interviewed everyone even remotely connected to the airport crew, offering deals, threatening prosecution. trying to find the weak link who would break omerta and provide testimony. The pressure was immense, and several people who were questioned suddenly disappeared, victims of Burke's assumption that anyone who talked to the FBI, even to refuse cooperation, was potentially compromised. Henry Hill was also being investigated, though his problems were related to his drug trafficking rather than Lufanza. The narcotics operation that he, Anthony, and others had been running was now fully visible to federal authorities. The D had identified the participants, documented transactions, and was preparing to make arrests. The walls were closing in from multiple directions. Anthony's survival instincts told him to distance himself from the crew, to lie low, to minimize his visibility. But distancing himself would be seen as suspicious, potentially indicating cooperation with authorities. He was trapped in a situation where every move was potentially fatal, where staying close to the crew meant risking being caught up in the next round of murders. But pulling away meant being suspected of informing. The paranoia extended beyond the Lufanza participants to anyone who might know anything about anything. Bookmakers who had taken bets for the crew, loan shark victims who might try to trade information for forgiveness of debts, mistresses who had heard too much pillow talk, corrupt cops who had been on the payroll but might flip to save their careers. Everyone was a potential threat, and Jimmy Burke's default response to threats was elimination. Paul Vario was also concerned, though for different reasons. The Lufanza heist had generated exactly the kind of attention he had always tried to avoid. His operations were being scrutinized, his associates were being arrested, and his comfortable position in the Lucchese family hierarchy was being threatened by all the chaos. Vario began making his own calculations about who needed to be eliminated to protect the organization. Anthony found himself caught between these powerful forces. Jimmy Burke on one side, paranoid and murderous, eliminating anyone who might be a threat. Paul Vario on the other side, trying to protect the larger organization and willing to sacrifice individuals to do it. And the FBI everywhere, watching, waiting, building cases that would eventually ensnare dozens of mobsters. The bodies continued to accumulate, each one a reminder of how cheap life was in their world, how quickly friendship could turn to murder, how little the supposed code of honor meant when survival was at stake. Anthony had entered the mob believing in loyalty, believing in the bonds of brotherhood, believing that men who had bled together would die together. He was learning that all of it was lies, that every man was ultimately alone, that the only loyalty that mattered was to oneself. But even that bitter wisdom wasn't enough to save him. April 25th, 1980, was the day Anthony Stable's world truly ended, though he wouldn't know it immediately. That was the day Henry Hill was arrested on federal narcotics charges, caught in a sting operation that had been months in the making. The arrest itself was not particularly notable. Mobsters got arrested all the time. What made this arrest catastrophic was what Henry decided to do next. Faced with the prospect of spending decades in federal prison, Henry Hill made the calculation that many before him had made, but few had survived. He chose cooperation. He agreed to become a government witness, to testify against his former associates, to violate omerta so completely that it would destroy the entire organization he had been part of. The decision came after a night in jail, after his wife Karen refused to post bail, after his lawyer explained that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that the mandatory minimum sentence for his charges was essentially life in prison for someone Henry's age. The prosecutor offered a deal. Testify truthfully about organized crime activities and you'll receive protection and a new identity through the witness protection program. Refuse and spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary. Henry took the deal. The implications were staggering. Henry Hill knew everything. He had been part of the crew for decades, had participated in countless crimes, had witnessed murders, had been present for discussions of Lufanza and numerous other major operations. His testimony could put dozens of people in prison for the rest of their lives. When news of Henry's cooperation reached the crew, the reaction was one of shock and fury. Henry Hill, who had been one of them, who had eaten at their tables and attended their celebrations, who had been trusted with their secrets and their lives, had betrayed them all. The violation was so complete, so total, that it seemed almost impossible to believe. Anthony Stable's immediate response was likely terror. He had committed numerous crimes with Henry over the years. Henry could testify about hijackings, about drug deals, about murders he had witnessed, about conversations he had overheard. Anthony's involvement in all of it was now in the hands of a man who had proven willing to trade his friends' lives for his own freedom. But more immediately threatening was the question of whether Anthony himself might be suspected of cooperating. In the paranoid atmosphere that followed Henry's flip, anyone who had been close to Henry was automatically suspect. Had Anthony been talking to the FBI? Had he encouraged Henry to cooperate? Was he planning to follow Henry into the witness protection program? Jimmy Burke's response to Henry's betrayal was predictable. He wanted Henry dead. The problem was that Henry was now in federal custody, protected by teams of FBI agents and U.S. Marshals, virtually impossible to reach. Burke would have to content himself with fantasies of revenge while dealing with the practical reality that Henry's testimony was going to destroy what remained of the crew. The prosecutions began in earnest. Paul Vario was indicted on numerous charges stemming from Henry's testimony. Jimmy Burke faced charges related to the point-shaving scandal at Boston College, a scheme that Henry detailed in his testimony, and would later be convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Dozens of other mobsters and associates were arrested, charged, and convicted based on Henry's testimony and the corroborating evidence that investigators had gathered. Anthony Stable, remarkably, managed to avoid prosecution in the immediate aftermath of Henry's cooperation. Whether this was because Henry didn't have sufficient direct knowledge of Anthony's crimes, or because prosecutors decided to focus on bigger targets, or simply luck, Anthony remained free while many of his associates were being led away in handcuffs. But this freedom was in many ways worse than imprisonment. Anthony was now living in a world where everyone was suspicious of everyone else, where any associate could be wearing a wire, where being called to a meeting might mean driving to your own execution. The FBI was actively trying to flip additional witnesses, offering deals, threatening prosecution, exploiting the paranoia that Henry's betrayal had created. Henry Hill himself was in a different kind of prison. The witness protection program provided physical safety, but at the cost of everything he had known. He was given a new identity, relocated to a city where he knew no one, forbidden from contacting anyone from his former life. His wife Karen and their children were relocated with him, but the strain of the situation would eventually destroy their marriage. Henry would later describe the witness protection experience as worse than prison. He was an alcoholic and drug addict, cut off from his supply networks, a gregarious social creature forced into isolation, a man whose entire identity had been tied to being a wise guy, now required to pretend he was a civilian. He violated the program's rules repeatedly, getting kicked out and reinstated multiple times, unable to fully abandon the life, even though he had betrayed it. For Anthony Stable and the other survivors of the crew, Henry's betrayal represented the final proof that loyalty in their world was a myth. If Henry, charismatic, embedded, seemingly devoted to the life, could flip, than anyone could. Every relationship was now suspect. Every conversation was potentially evidence. Every friend was a potential enemy. The psychological toll was immense. Anthony had spent his entire adult life in a world governed by specific rules, where loyalty was supposedly the highest virtue, where betrayal was the ultimate sin. Henry's cooperation had exposed those principles as hollow, revealing that when facing serious prison time, men would sacrifice their friends, their honor, and their supposed code without hesitation. Anthony's relationship with his brother Thomas likely became strained during this period. Thomas, a prominent capo regime in the Lucchese family, had obligations to the organization that might conflict with his loyalty to Anthony. If the family decided that Anthony was a liability, if they suspected him of cooperating or feared he might, Thomas would be expected to participate in his elimination. Blood relationships were important in the mob, but they didn't trump organizational survival. The fabric of the organized crime world was tearing apart, and Anthony Stabile was caught in the middle of it, trying to survive in a system that had become utterly predatory, where the only rule was save yourself, and the only certainty was that it would end badly. Sometime in the early 1980s, the exact date is lost to history. Buried in the murky records of mob operations, Jimmy Burke gave Anthony Stabile an assignment: go to Florida and locate Henry Hill. The mission's ultimate purpose was clear, though it might never have been explicitly stated. Once Henry was located, he would be killed. This was the moment when Anthony's loyalty was being tested in the most direct way possible. He was being asked to participate in the murder of someone who had been his friend, someone he had committed crimes with, someone whose family he knew. The fact that Henry had betrayed them all was supposed to make the decision easy. Betrayal demanded death, but actually carrying out that death was something else entirely. Henry Hill, even in the witness protection program, had not been particularly careful about hiding. He violated the program's rules repeatedly, traveling to areas where he wasn't supposed to go, contacting people he should have avoided, engaging in the kind of behavior that made him locatable for anyone sufficiently motivated to find him. Burke was motivated, and he believed that Anthony Stabile could get close enough to Henry to make the hit possible. The plan, as it developed, involved luring Henry out of hiding with the promise of a business opportunity or perhaps a nostalgic meeting with an old friend. Anthony would make contact, arrange a meeting in a secluded location, and either kill Henry himself or hold him until Burke's designated killers could arrive. It was a straightforward plan, the kind that had worked countless times before, but Anthony never completed the mission. Whether because he couldn't locate Henry, or because Henry's sixth sense warned him away from the meeting, or because Anthony himself had misgivings about committing what would have been, in mob terms, a justified execution, the hit never happened. Henry remained alive, continuing to testify, continuing to violate the witness protection program's rules, continuing to live the complicated existence of a cooperating witness who couldn't fully abandon his criminal identity. Anthony's failure to complete the Florida mission placed him in an incredibly dangerous position. Jimmy Burke's paranoia was already extreme, and failure to carry out an assigned hit would naturally raise questions. Was Anthony unwilling to kill Henry because they were still friendly? Had Anthony been in contact with Henry beyond the parameters of the assigned mission? Was Anthony himself considering cooperation with authorities? These questions, once raised, were impossible to definitively answer. In Burke's paranoid worldview, suspicion was tantamount to guilt. If Anthony couldn't be trusted to eliminate Henry, then perhaps Anthony himself needed to be eliminated. The logic was brutal, but internally consistent. Anyone who might cooperate must be killed before they can cooperate. Anthony returned from Florida, presumably reporting that he had been unable to locate Henry, or that the circumstances hadn't allowed for the hit to be completed. This explanation may or may not have satisfied Burke, but it certainly didn't alleviate his suspicions. Anthony was now on a list not of people definitively marked for death, but of people who bore watching, whose loyalty was in question, who might need to be eliminated if circumstances warranted. The psychological pressure on Anthony during this period must have been overwhelming. He was being asked to participate in murders of former friends, while simultaneously knowing that he himself might be next on the list. Every phone call could be a summons to his own execution. Every meeting could be his last. The life that had once seemed glamorous and exciting had devolved into a nightmare of suspicion and fear. Henry Hill, safely ensconced in the Witness Protection Program, despite his numerous violations of its rules, continued living while Anthony and others faced the consequences of his betrayal. Henry would later write a book about his experiences. Wise Guy, published in 1985 by Nicholas Pileggi, that would become a bestseller and eventually the basis for Goodfellas. He would profit from his betrayal, become a minor celebrity, appear on television and radio shows, dining out on stories about the very people whose lives he had destroyed. Anthony Stabile would never get that opportunity. His story would be told by others, filtered through Henry's testimony and Hollywood's imagination, reduced to a few lines in a film, a brief mention in mob histories. But in 1980, as he returned from Florida, having failed to kill Henry Hill, Anthony's immediate concern wasn't his historical legacy. It was simply staying alive. The years between Henry Hill's betrayal in 1980 and Anthony Stabile's murder in 1985 were a slow-motion collapse, a gradual disintegration of everything that had once defined Anthony's world. The crew that had seemed so formidable was now scattered dead or imprisoned. The code of loyalty had been exposed as fiction. The life that had promised wealth and respect delivered only paranoia and death. Anthony was living on borrowed time, and he knew it. The question was not whether he would be killed, but when, and by who, and for what specific reason in the paranoid calculus of organized crime in the early 1980s. There were multiple reasons why Anthony Stabile might be targeted for elimination. First, there was his involvement in the drug trade. Paul Vario had explicitly forbidden narcotics trafficking, and while he had tolerated it during the profitable years, the aftermath of Henry's betrayal made that tolerance unsustainable. Anyone who had violated the drug prohibition was now viewed with suspicion. If they had been willing to defy one rule, might they be willing to violate omerta as well? Second, there was the simple fact that Anthony knew too much. He had been present for, or had knowledge of multiple murders. Including the Spider Junko killing, he knew details about countless hijackings, loan sharking operations, extortion schemes, and other crimes. In an environment where the FBI was actively seeking witnesses, anyone with that much knowledge was a liability. Third, there was his perceived failure to kill Henry Hill. Whether or not Burke explicitly blamed Anthony for this failure, the fact remained that Henry was alive, continuing to testify, continuing to damage the organization. In Burke's mind, someone had to bear responsibility for that failure, and Anthony was the obvious candidate. Fourth, there were rumors, whether true or manufactured, that Anthony had been talking to federal authorities. In the mob world, being accused of cooperation is often tantamount to being guilty of it. The mere suspicion, once raised, becomes impossible to disprove. And in an organization as paranoid as the post-Lufthansa airport crew, suspicion was deadly. Anthony attempted to lay low, reducing his visibility, avoiding the locations where he might be most vulnerable. But a mobster can't simply disappear without raising even more suspicion. He still had to attend required meetings, still had to maintain relationships with his associates, still had to show his face in his neighborhood. Disappearing completely would be interpreted as an admission of guilt. A prelude to cooperation, his brother Thomas was in an impossible position. As a caporegime in the Lucchese family, Thomas had obligations to the organization that might require him to participate in Anthony's murder, or at least to acquiesce to it. The fraternal bond between them was genuine, but in their world, blood relationships were subordinate to organizational loyalty. Thomas knew what was coming, but was powerless to stop it. Jimmy Burke, by this time, was serving a prison sentence for the Boston College point-shaving scheme that Henry's testimony had exposed. But Burke's reach extended beyond prison walls. He could still order hits, still influence events, still determine who lived and died from his prison cell. Burke was eliminating the last loose ends from the Lufanza operation, methodically working through a list of people who needed to die. The Lucchese family's upper administration was also taking action. Henry Hill's cooperation had damaged the family's operation severely. Paul Vario had been convicted and imprisoned. Dozens of soldiers and associates had been arrested. The family needed to demonstrate that betrayal would be punished, that witnesses would be eliminated, that cooperation was not a viable path to safety. Anthony Stabile represented everything the family needed to eliminate. He had been close to Henry Hill. He had violated the drug prohibition. He knew details about numerous crimes, and he had failed to complete an assigned hit. Whether any of these factors alone would have been sufficient to justify his murder is debatable. Combined, they made his death inevitable. The specific mechanism of Anthony's ultimate fate remains disputed. Some sources suggest Jimmy Burke ordered the hit from prison, seeing Anthony as a potential witness who needed to be silenced. Other sources attribute the decision to the Lucchese administration, particularly to Anthony's own family connections. Still others suggest it was a Gambino family operation, related to Anthony's nominal membership in that organization. The most commonly cited suspect in Anthony's murder is a Gambino soldier named Bimbo Frangenti. Frangenti was a known hitman, someone who had carried out multiple murders on behalf of the family. If the Gambinos had decided that Anthony needed to be eliminated, perhaps because he was seen as a liability to their airport operations, or because killing him sent a message to other potential witnesses, Frangenti would have been a logical choice to carry out the hit. But whether it was Frangenti acting on Gambino orders, or someone from the Lucchese family executing Burke's instructions, or some combination of factors, the result was the same. Anthony Stabile was a marked man, living on borrowed time, waiting for the inevitable moment when someone he knew and trusted would betray him one final time. The last months of Anthony's life must have been psychological torture. Every car that followed him might be surveillance or assassins. Every phone call might be a summons to his execution. Every meeting might be his last. He had to maintain the appearance of normality, continuing his criminal activities, attending social functions, interacting with associates, while knowing that any one of them might be planning his death. Sleep, when it came, must have been fitful and anxious. Anthony would have known the patterns of mob hits, the call to an unexpected meeting, the friendly conversation that lulls you into complacency, the moment when you realize what's happening, but it's too late to save yourself. He had witnessed enough murders to know exactly how it would unfold, could mentally rehearse his own death, down to the final bullet. Did he consider cooperating with authorities? The thought must have crossed his mind. The FBI would have been delighted to flip someone with Anthony's knowledge and connections. They would have offered the same deal they gave Henry. Testify truthfully, and we'll protect you. Give you a new identity. It would have meant safety, or at least the possibility of safety. But Anthony never took that path, whether from loyalty to his remaining friends, or fear of what cooperation would mean for his family, or simply because he couldn't imagine himself as a rat. Anthony chose to remain silent. He would die by the code, even though the code had never protected him, even though loyalty in their world was a one-way obligation that flowed up but never down. In 1985, the call finally came. Or perhaps it wasn't a call. Perhaps it was an unexpected visit, or a chance encounter carefully orchestrated to seem accidental, or simply men appearing out of the darkness with guns. However it happened, Anthony Stable's final moments had arrived. The exact circumstances of Anthony Stable's murder on that night in 1985 remain shrouded in the secrecy that characterizes all mob hits. There were no witnesses willing to come forward, no security cameras that captured the event, no physical evidence that survived the subsequent fire. What we know comes from police reports, forensic evidence, and the patterns of organized crime murders that allow us to reconstruct with reasonable confidence how Anthony's last hours unfolded. He was likely lured to a meeting with someone he trusted. This is standard procedure for mob hits. You can't kill a cautious, experienced gangster if he knows he's walking into danger. The approach requires someone familiar, someone who has earned trust over years of association, someone whose invitation would seem routine and non-threatening. Perhaps it was framed as a business meeting, a discussion about a potential score, an opportunity to make money. Perhaps it was positioned as a social occasion, drinks with old friends, nothing formal or concerning. Perhaps it was simply a request for help with something minor, the kind of favor that members of the crew regularly asked of each other. Anthony would have dressed appropriately, one of his expensive suits, polished shoes, the jewelry that announced his status. He would have checked his appearance in the mirror, made sure he looked like a man who had his life together, who wasn't afraid, who remained a respected member of the organization. Appearance was everything in their world, and showing fear or weakness was an invitation to be victimized. He drove his own car, a Cadillac, because in their world, the car you drove said something about your success and status. The Cadillac was comfortable, powerful, a statement that Anthony Stable was still somebody, still worthy of respect. He couldn't have known that this car would become his coffin, his funeral pyre, the location where firefighters would discover what remained of his body. The meeting location was probably somewhere relatively public, but not crowded, a bar, a restaurant, a social club where mob business was regularly conducted. Anthony walked in, saw familiar faces, relaxed slightly. These were his people, his crew, men he had known for years. There was no obvious threat, no indication that anything was wrong. Perhaps they had drinks, discussed business or sports or mutual acquaintances. Perhaps they laughed about shared memories, told stories about the old days when the crew was intact and the money was flowing. Perhaps Anthony felt, for a brief moment, that things were returning to normal, that he had survived a dangerous period and was being welcomed back into the fold. The betrayal, when it came, was probably swift and efficient. Someone produced a gun, perhaps, bimbo frangenti, if the most common attribution is correct. Perhaps someone else whose name has been lost to history. There might have been a moment of realization, a heartbeat where Anthony understood what was happening and knew with certainty that he was about to die. He was shot in the head, execution style. This was the mob's preferred method, quick, certain, and carrying a clear message about why the victim had died. A headshot indicated a professional hit, a sanctioned murder carried out under family orders. It was different from the panic killings or crimes of passion murders that occurred in civilian life. This was business, whether Anthony died instantly or lingered for a few seconds. Whether he had time to feel betrayed or angry, or afraid or simply surprised, we can never know. The bullet ended his consciousness, ended the life he had built, ended all the dreams and fears and memories that had defined his existence. His body was stuffed into the trunk of his own Cadillac. This was practical. It provided transport and disposal in one, but it was also symbolic. The mob had a tradition of using victims' own vehicles as their hearses. A final humiliation and a message to others about what happened to people who crossed the organization. The car was driven to Prospect Park in Brooklyn, a relatively isolated spot where the flames could burn without immediate interruption. The discrepancy in locations is typical of mob murders, where conflicting accounts and deliberate misinformation make it difficult to establish definitive facts decades later. What matters is that the location was chosen for its relative isolation, a place where the car could be destroyed without immediate discovery. Gasoline was poured over and inside the vehicle. Fire was the mob's preferred method for destroying evidence. It eliminated fingerprints, DNA, ballistic evidence, anything that might connect the murderers to their victim. The flames consumed the Cadillac's interior, charring Anthony's body beyond easy recognition, eliminating potential forensic evidence. But fire is an imperfect tool for evidence destruction. It draws attention, creates smoke that can be seen from considerable distance, summons firefighters who will inevitably discover whatever the fire was meant to conceal. The killers would have known this, would have anticipated that the body would eventually be found, but they were counting on the fire to eliminate the evidence that mattered. Who had done this and why? Firefighters arrived to extinguish the burning Cadillac, assuming at first that it was simply a car fire, perhaps a mechanical failure or an insurance fraud attempt. When they opened the trunk and found the body, they knew immediately that they were dealing with a homicide specifically. A mob hit, the execution-style gunshot wound, the attempt to destroy evidence with fire, the expensive car, all of it pointed to organized crime. The police were called, specifically homicide detectives who specialized in organized crime murders. They cordoned off the scene, began their investigation, took photographs, and collected what little evidence had survived the fire. They would have known from experience that solving this murder would be extraordinarily difficult. Mob hits were notoriously hard to prosecute because of omerta. Nobody saw anything. Nobody knew anything. Nobody would testify. Anthony Stable's body was taken to the medical examiner's office, where an autopsy would determine the precise cause of death. The gunshot wound to the head was obvious, but the autopsy would document other details: the caliber of the bullet, the angle of entry, any defensive wounds that might indicate Anthony had struggled or fought back. The charring from the fire was noted, along with the extensive damage it had caused to potential forensic evidence. Identifying the body would have been straightforward, despite the fire damage. Anthony had fingerprints on file from previous arrests, dental records that could be matched, and physical characteristics that family members could confirm. The identification was routine, but the notification to his family would have been devastating. His family details, of whom remain largely private and unclear from the historical record, were left to grieve. His brother Thomas, the prominent copper regime in the Lucchese family, would have known immediately what had happened and why, would have understood that the organization they both served had decided Anthony was expendable. The neighborhood where Anthony had lived and worked would have been abuzz with the news. A murder this high profile, involving someone so well known in organized crime circles, would have been the subject of intense speculation and rumor. People would have discussed who ordered the hit, who carried it out, what Anthony had done to deserve this fate. The conversations would have been conducted in whispers, always aware that talking too openly about mob business was dangerous. The crew that had once included Jimmy Burke, Henry Hill, Tommy DeSimone, and Anthony Stabile was now effectively destroyed. Tommy was dead, murdered by the Gambino family. Henry was in witness protection. Having betrayed everyone, Jimmy was in prison, serving a life sentence, and now Anthony was dead, murdered by the very organization he had served loyally. The dream they had all shared of wealth, respect, power, the gangster lifestyle that seemed so glamorous and exciting, had been revealed as a nightmare. Every one of them had paid an enormous price for their choices. Some, like Henry, survived, but at the cost of their identities and relationships. Others, like Anthony and Tommy, paid with their lives. The New York Police Department's investigation into Anthony Stabile's murder followed a familiar pattern: intensive initial effort, development of suspects, compilation of evidence, and ultimate frustration as witnesses refused to cooperate and the case foundered on the rocks of Omerta. Detective squads that specialized in organized crime were assigned to the case. These were experienced investigators who understood the unique challenges of mob murders. They knew that civilian homicides were often solved through witness testimony, forensic evidence, and perpetrator mistakes. Mob hits were different. They were professionally executed, carefully planned, and protected by a code of silence that made prosecutions extremely difficult. The investigators began with the basics: documenting the crime scene, collecting what physical evidence had survived the fire, interviewing Anthony's known associates, and compiling a timeline of his final days. They would have reviewed Anthony's criminal history, looking for recent conflicts or incidents that might explain the murder. They would have consulted with FBI agents who were tracking organized crime, sharing information and comparing notes. Bimbo Frangenti emerged as the primary suspect relatively quickly. His name surfaced through the network of informants that law enforcement cultivated within the mob, people who weren't willing to testify publicly, but who would provide information confidentially. Frangenti was a known hitman with a history of violence, someone who had carried out murders on behalf of the Gambino family. His connection to Anthony Stabile was documented, and his whereabouts around the time of the murder were suspicious. But knowing who probably committed a murder and proving it in court are entirely different things. The prosecution of a mob hit requires physical evidence, credible testimony, and a chain of evidence that can convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. In Anthony's case, almost none of that was available. The fire had destroyed most physical evidence. The bullet recovered from Anthony's skull could tell investigators what caliber weapon had been used, but couldn't definitively link it to any specific gun unless that weapon was recovered, which it never was. Fingerprints that might have been on the car or the body were gone, consumed by the flames. DNA evidence, still a relatively new tool in 1985, was unlikely to have survived the fire in usable form. Witness testimony was completely unavailable. The code of silence meant that people who knew what had happened, and there were certainly people who knew, would never speak to police. Being labeled a rat was a death sentence in the mob, and the consequences extended to your family. Nobody was willing to trade their own life and their family's safety for the dubious satisfaction of seeing Anthony's killer prosecuted. Frangenti himself, when located and questioned, invoked his right to remain silent. This was standard procedure. Experienced mobsters knew never to speak to police without a lawyer present. And even with a lawyer, the advice was always to say nothing. Silence couldn't be used against you in court, but anything you said could be twisted and used as evidence. The investigators tried various tactics to break the case. They interviewed Anthony's family members, hoping someone might have information about threats he had received or conflicts he was involved in. They pressured low-level criminals associated with the Gambino and Lucchese families, offering deals and threatening prosecution in an attempt to develop witnesses. They reviewed surveillance footage and phone records, looking for any connection between Frangenti and Anthony in the days before the murder. All of it led nowhere. The wall of silence was impenetrable. Anthony's family members knew better than to cooperate. Their safety depended on being seen as loyal to the code, and testifying against mobsters would put them at risk. Low-level criminals weren't willing to trade their lives for reduced sentences on minor charges. Surveillance and phone records, conducted before modern technology made such monitoring ubiquitous, provided only fragmentary information that proved nothing. The case grew cold, joining the hundreds of other unsolved mob murders that littered NYPD case files. Detectives moved on to fresher cases, more solvable crimes, investigations where their efforts might actually result in convictions. Anthony Stable's murder file was boxed up and placed in storage, technically still open, but practically abandoned. One more unsolved killing in a city where violence was common and justice was rare. Bimbo Frangenti, if he was indeed the killer, went into hiding for a time, but eventually resumed his life in organized crime. He knew that without witnesses or physical evidence, prosecution was unlikely. The statute of limitations didn't apply to murder, so he would theoretically remain liable for prosecution for the rest of his life. But as a practical matter, the case was closed. For Anthony's family, the lack of justice must have been devastating. Their husband and father had been murdered, his body found burned in a car trunk, and nobody would be held accountable. There would be no trial, no conviction, no sense that the person responsible had paid for their crime. Instead, they were left with only questions. Exactly what had Anthony done to deserve this? Who had ordered his death? Had he known it was coming? Had he suffered? The answers to these questions, if they existed, were locked away in the minds of men who would never speak, protected by a code that valued silence over truth, loyalty to criminals over justice for victims. Anthony Stable's murder would remain officially unsolved. Another casualty of organized crime's war against law enforcement. Another example of how difficult it is to prosecute mob killings when everyone who knows the truth refuses to talk. Anthony Stable's death in 1985 should have been the end of his story. Another forgotten gangster. Another mob murder. Another file that would gather dust in a police archive. In the normal course of events, his name would have faded from memory, known only to family members and the few historians who specialize in organized crime. But fate had something different in store. 5 years after Anthony's death, director Martin Scorsese released Goodfellas, a film based on Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy, which told the story of Henry Hill's life in the mob. The film would become one of the greatest gangster movies ever made, a cultural touchstone that defined how Americans understood organized crime. And in that film, in the famous bamboo lounge scene where Henry Hill introduces the audience to his crew, there is a moment brief but significant where the camera finds Anthony Stable sitting at a table, and Henry's narration says simply, "And there was Anthony Stable." Actor Frank Adonis portrayed Anthony in that scene, giving the character a quiet dignity and presence that elevated him beyond a mere name check. It was, in some ways, a small role. Anthony appears in only a few scenes, speaks minimal dialogue, and doesn't drive the narrative, but his presence in the film was significant. His name immortalized for audiences who would never have known about him otherwise. The irony is profound. Anthony spent his entire life in the shadows, a supporting player in other people's stories, someone who never sought the spotlight, who operated in the carefully concealed world of organized crime. He would have wanted to remain anonymous, to live and die without public notice, to be forgotten by everyone, except those who knew him personally instead. Through the accident of being associated with Henry Hill and appearing in the book and film that made Henry famous, Anthony Stabile achieved a form of immortality that his killers certainly never intended. Goodfellas has been watched by millions of people worldwide, studied in film schools, analyzed by critics, quoted endlessly in popular culture. And in that film, Anthony Stabile's name appears, ensuring that he will be remembered long after his killers have been forgotten. The film presented a glamorized, stylized version of mob life that captured some truths while eliding others. The camaraderie was real. The crew genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Shared bonds forged through shared danger. The money was real. The airport crew was enormously profitable during its peak years. The violence was real, though perhaps less frequent than movies suggest. It was always present as a potential solution to problems. What the film couldn't fully capture was the paranoia, the constant fear, the grinding anxiety of living as a criminal under surveillance, the knowledge that any friend might become an enemy, that loyalty was conditional, that the life would end badly. These elements are present in Goodfellas, but filtered through entertainment requirements and runtime limitations for Anthony's family. The film's release must have been complicated. On one hand, it brought renewed attention to Anthony's murder, reminded people of his existence, gave him a kind of recognition. On the other hand, it portrayed him as a criminal, associated him with murders and robberies and violence, and forced his family to relive the trauma of his death. His son Joseph would have been in his early 20s when Goodfellas was released, old enough to understand what his father had been, old enough to process the film's portrayal of that world. Did Joseph see the film? Did he recognize his father in Frank Adonis's performance? Did he feel pride at seeing his father represented on screen, or shame at the criminal activities being depicted? These questions remain unanswered, lost to the same privacy that shields most mob families from public scrutiny. Joseph Stabile, if he is still alive, has maintained silence about his father, choosing not to participate in interviews or documentaries, not to profit from his father's notoriety. It's a choice that speaks to dignity and perhaps to pain some stories are too personal to share with strangers. Anthony's brother Thomas continued in organized crime after Anthony's death, remaining active in the Lucchese family until his own death in 1999. Thomas's career trajectory rising to captain, while Anthony remained a soldier, illustrated the different paths available within the mob hierarchy. Thomas had the political skills and organizational abilities necessary to command, while Anthony had been the reliable worker who executed orders without questioning them. Did Thomas feel guilt about Anthony's death? Did he know in advance that his brother was going to be killed? Did he participate in the decision, or was he simply informed after the fact? These questions too remain unanswered, protected by the same code of silence that prevented Anthony's murder from being solved. The broader legacy of Anthony Stabile's story is what it reveals about organized crime's reality versus its mythology. The mob sells itself as an organization built on honor, loyalty, and respect for tradition. The reality, as Anthony's life and death demonstrate, is far different. It's a world where friends murder friends, where blood relationships are subordinate to organizational concerns, where loyalty flows in only one direction, where the code of honor is a convenient fiction that dissolves the moment it becomes inconvenient. Anthony Stabile was not a good man. He participated in hijackings, drug trafficking, loan sharking, and other crimes. He was present at murders and helped dispose of bodies. He lived his entire adult life as a criminal, choosing money and respect over legality and morality. His victims the businessmen extorted, the addicts sold drugs. The families terrorized have their own stories, their own pain, their own right to justice. But Anthony was also a human being, someone who grew up in circumstances that offered limited options, who made choices that seemed rational within his worldview, who believed in the principles his organization claimed to uphold. He was loyal when loyalty should have been rewarded. He followed orders when following orders should have earned protection. He kept silent when keeping silent was supposed to guarantee security. And in return, he was murdered by the very people he had served. His body burned in an attempt to destroy evidence, his death unsolved and unavenged. His story reduced to a few lines in a movie and scattered references in mob histories. That's the true legacy of Anthony Stabile, not glamour or respect or the gangster lifestyle, but betrayal, violence, and a lonely death in the trunk of a car. It's a cautionary tale about the price of choosing crime, about the hollowness of honor among thieves, about how the life that promises everything delivers only suffering and death. To understand Anthony Stabile's story fully, we must place it in the broader context of American organized crime in the second half of the 20th century, the period from roughly 1950 to 1985. The span of Anthony's criminal career is often described as the golden age of the mob, a time when the five families dominated New York's underworld and wielded enormous power. But the concept of a golden age is misleading, a romantic myth that obscures the brutal reality. Yes, the families generated enormous revenue. Yes, they operated with relative impunity for decades. Yes, they wielded significant political and economic influence. But for the individual mobsters like Anthony, the reality was far less golden. The structure of the five families Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, Bonanno created a seemingly stable hierarchy that distributed power and territory, while minimizing destructive conflicts. The Commission, established in the 1930s, served as a governing body that could authorize major actions and mediate disputes, preventing the kind of open warfare that had characterized earlier periods. Within each family, the hierarchy was rigid. The boss at the top, the underboss as second in command, the consigliere as advisor, captains commanding crews of soldiers and associates. This structure provided clear lines of authority and communication, ensuring that orders flowed down and tribute flowed up. But the system was also inherently exploitative. Soldiers and associates did the dangerous work, the robberies, the murders, the collections, while bosses and captains took the largest shares of the profits. A successful hijacking that generated $100,000 might leave the actual thieves with $10,000 or $20,000 after everyone above them took their cut. The people taking the greatest risks received the smallest rewards. Additionally, the system created perverse incentives. Bosses wanted their soldiers to be loyal and productive, but not so successful that they became threats. Ambitious soldiers who made too much money or gained too much respect could be seen as potential rivals and eliminated. The result was a glass ceiling that kept most gangsters in perpetual subordinate positions, never quite successful enough to rise, but valuable enough to be exploited. The FBI's increasing effectiveness in the 1970s and 1980s further eroded whatever Advantages organized crime membership had once provided. The passage of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act in 1970 gave prosecutors powerful new tools to dismantle criminal organizations. RICO allowed the government to charge individuals with being part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, using evidence of a pattern of racketeering activity to secure convictions. Previously, prosecutors had to prove specific crimes committed by specific individuals. If you robbed a truck, they had to prove you robbed that particular truck. With evidence and witnesses and physical proof, RICO changed the game. Now they could prove you were part of an organization that robbed trucks. Using testimony about organizational structure and patterns of behavior, the impact was devastating. Beginning in the mid-1980s, RICO prosecutions began dismantling the five families systematically. Bosses who had seemed untouchable were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Entire crews were arrested in coordinated raids. The organizational structure that had protected members for decades was being used against them as prosecutors built cases showing how the families functioned and how individual members fit into the larger enterprise. Electronic surveillance technology also improved dramatically during this period. The FBI could now plant listening devices that were nearly impossible to detect, could intercept phone calls with minimal physical access, could photograph and videotape mobsters without their knowledge. The old methods of avoiding surveillance meeting in public places using coded language, being alert for tails became less effective as technology advanced. The influx of narcotics money, while enormously profitable, also brought unprecedented law enforcement action. The federal government's war on drugs created specialized agencies with significant budgets and broad powers. Drug trafficking wasn't handled by local police who could be corrupted or intimidated. It was handled by federal agents who were largely immune to mob influence. The combination of RICO prosecutions, improved surveillance, aggressive drug enforcement, and cooperating witnesses created a perfect storm that destroyed the five families' dominance. By the early 1990s, the bosses of 4 of the 5 families had been convicted and imprisoned. The organizational structure was in shambles, with successors being arrested almost as quickly as they were appointed. For Anthony Stabile, who entered the mob when it seemed powerful and invincible, and died just as its long decline was becoming obvious. The timing was particularly tragic. He had bought into the myth of the mob's permanence, believed in the organization's ability to protect its members, trusted that loyalty would be rewarded. Instead, he lived long enough to see the myth dissolve, but not long enough to find a way out. The Golden Age, if it ever truly existed, was built on foundations that were always crumbling. The code of honor was always a lie, honored more in the breach than the observance. The promise of wealth was available only to those at the top of the hierarchy. The sense of brotherhood was conditional, lasting only as long as it served organizational interests. The protection that membership supposedly provided was illusory, evaporating the moment you became inconvenient. Anthony Stabile's generation of mobsters was perhaps the last to truly believe in the mythology. They had grown up watching older gangsters who seemed to have cracked the code, who lived well and died peacefully. They believed they could do the same, that the old rules would continue to apply, that the life would deliver what it promised. Instead, they discovered too late that the rules had changed, that the organization would sacrifice anyone to preserve itself, that loyalty was a one-way obligation, and that the only certainty was a bad-ending prison if you were lucky, death if you weren't, and for almost everyone, eventual poverty, as the money that seemed infinite proved to be as temporary as everything else in that world. The Lufanza heist executed on December 11, 1978, was the largest cash robbery in American history at the time. The haul exceeded $6 million, an almost unimaginable sum that should have made everyone involved wealthy beyond their dreams. Instead, it became a death sentence for nearly everyone connected to it, a curse that destroyed lives with systematic efficiency. Jimmy Burke's paranoia-driven murder spree following the heist created a body count that would have been shocking even by mob standards. The victims included both people who had directly participated in the robbery and those who simply knew too much about it. Burke's logic was coldly practical. Dead people can't testify. Every potential witness was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Parnell Stacks Edwards was the first, killed just 10 days after the robbery, on December 18, 1978. Assigned to destroy the getaway van, he left it parked illegally, complete with fingerprints and evidence. Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Seep shot him multiple times in the head, a brutal lesson in the cost of failure. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker and wig shop owner who tipped off the crew about Lufthansa's cash shipments, vanished on January 6, 1979. He'd been pressing Burke for his promised cut and was seen as a risk to talk. His body was never recovered. Richard Eaton, a hustler helping launder heist money through a fake drug scam, was tortured and murdered in January 1979 after being accused of skimming. His hog-tied body was found frozen in a refrigerated meat truck. Tom DeSimone, Eaton's Florida associate in the laundering scheme, was killed shortly after for the same alleged skimming. Louis Fazzi Cafoa and his wife Joanna disappeared in March 1979. Cafoa, involved in planning, drew attention by flaunting his share, including buying Joanna a flashy pink Cadillac. Their bodies were never found. Joe Buda, Manry, and Robert Frenchy McMahon, both key insiders on the robbery crew, were executed together in May 1979, shot in a car as Burke tightened his noose on potential witnesses. By the summer of 1979, 8 men associated with the robbery were dead or missing. The body count would eventually exceed a dozen, though the exact number is disputed. Some sources claim as many as 12 to 15 people connected to Lufthansa were killed. The staggering scope of these murders reveals something profound about Jimmy Burke's character and the mob's operational reality. Rather than give everyone $400,000 or $500,000 apiece, Burke found it easier to eliminate them. As Henry Hill later explained, dead partners don't require payment, don't demand their share, and most importantly, can't testify. The irony is devastating. The Lufthansa heist was supposed to make everyone rich, to be the score that set them up for life. Instead, it became a death sentence. Most of the people who had worked on or knew about the robbery were dead within 18 months. The money, nearly $6 million, was never recovered. It had been spent, laundered, hidden, or simply disappeared into Burke's pockets, while his former partners disappeared into unmarked graves. Louis Werner, the Lufthansa cargo agent who had provided the intelligence that made the heist possible, was the only person ever convicted. He received 15 years in prison and, ironically, survived protected by incarceration from Burke's murderous paranoia. Werner couldn't provide prosecutors with information about the actual robbery crew because Burke had deliberately insulated himself, using intermediaries to communicate with Werner. Jimmy Burke himself was never charged with the Lufthansa heist or any of the subsequent murders. The evidence was insufficient. The witnesses were dead, and Burke had been careful enough to avoid direct connection to the robbery. He was eventually convicted of the Boston College point-shaving scheme and an unrelated murder, dying in prison in 1996 from lung cancer. Having never paid for his role in the greatest heist in American history, or the dozen murders it spawned, Anthony Stabile watched this carnage unfold from the periphery. He hadn't been part of the Lufanza crew, but he was close enough to understand the implications. Every murder sent the same message. Loyalty meant nothing. Friendship meant nothing. Years of working together meant nothing. When survival was at stake, Jimmy Burke would kill anyone. And if Burke would kill his closest associates' men, who had participated in the robbery, who had made him rich, who had proven their loyalty repeatedly, what would stop him from killing someone like Anthony, whose only crime was knowing too much? The answer, of course, was nothing. Nothing would stop Burke, or Paul Vario, or the Lucchese family administration, or whoever ultimately decided that Anthony Stabile needed to die. The Lufanza heist had proven that in their world, human life had no intrinsic value. It was simply a variable in a calculation about risk and reward, to be eliminated when the equation demanded it, while bodies accumulated around him, while friends and associates were systematically murdered. Henry Hill survived. He survived through betrayal, through cooperation, through abandoning every principle that supposedly governed mob life, and in surviving, he achieved a kind of immortality that his dead friends would never know, though at a cost that some might consider worse than death. Henry's decision to cooperate with federal authorities in 1980 was, from his perspective, pure pragmatism. He was facing decades in prison on narcotics charges. The evidence against him was overwhelming wiretaps, surveillance, testimony from his drug customers who had themselves been arrested and flipped. His wife Karen had refused to post bail, understanding that their life together was over. His closest associate, Jimmy Burke, was already planning his murder. The witness protection program offered what seemed like a miracle: safety, a new identity, freedom instead of prison. All he had to do was tell the truth about his criminal career, testify against his former friends, and help prosecutors dismantle the organization he had belonged to for decades. To men like Anthony Stabile, who still believed in the code despite all evidence to the contrary, Henry's decision was incomprehensible. No matter what punishment you faced, you were supposed to accept it silently. Do your time and never cooperate. Omerta, the code of silence, was supposed to be absolute, unbreakable, worth dying for. But Henry saw through the mythology. The code was a tool used by bosses to protect themselves while sacrificing their subordinates. Loyalty flowed upward, but rarely downward. When push came to shove, the organization would sacrifice anyone to preserve itself. So why should he sacrifice himself for an organization that would discard him without hesitation? Henry's testimony was devastating. He provided prosecutors with details about Lucchese's capo Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, and other Mafia members, along with information about the Boston College basketball point-shaving scandal. His testimony led to Burke's conviction on 2 separate counts and imprisonment, along with convictions for Paul Vario and numerous other mobsters. The scope of prosecution stemming from Henry's cooperation was staggering. Over 50 convictions resulted from his testimony and the corroborating evidence that investigators gathered. The airport crew was effectively destroyed. The Lucchese family's operations at JFK were dismantled. Decades of carefully constructed criminal enterprises collapsed because one man decided that his own survival was more important than organizational loyalty. But Henry's life in the witness protection program was far from the happy ending that such survival might suggest. He was relocated to a city where he knew no one, given a new name, forbidden from contacting anyone from his former life. His wife Karen and their children were relocated with him. But the strain of the situation would eventually destroy their marriage. Henry was an addict both to drugs and to the lifestyle he had lived. The witness protection program could provide physical safety, but couldn't satisfy his psychological needs. He was a gregarious man who thrived on social interaction, now forced into isolation. He was someone whose entire identity had been built around being a wise guy, now required to pretend he was a civilian. The result was predictable. Henry violated the program's rules, repeatedly drinking heavily, using drugs, committing minor crimes, contacting people from his former life. He was kicked out of the program and reinstated multiple times. The FBI agents assigned to monitor him became increasingly frustrated with his inability or unwillingness to follow the rules that were keeping him alive. In 1986, journalist Nicholas Pileggi approached Henry about writing a book based on his life in the mob. The result was Wise Guy, Life in a Mafia Family, published in 1986. The same year Anthony Stabile was murdered, the book was a bestseller, providing unprecedented insight into the daily operations of organized crime from someone who had lived it. 5 years later, director Martin Scorsese adapted Wise Guy into Goodfellas, one of the greatest films ever made. The movie starred Ray Liotta as Henry, Robert De Niro as Jimmy Burke, renamed Jimmy Conway for the film, and Joe Pesci as Tommy DeSimone, renamed Tommy DeVito. The film was both critically acclaimed and commercially successful, earning Academy Award nominations and becoming a cultural touchstone. Henry Hill thus achieved a form of fame that no other mob informant had ever experienced. He became a celebrity, appearing on television and radio shows, giving interviews, lecturing to groups about organized crime. He dined out on stories about the very people he had betrayed, profiting from their deaths and imprisonments. For Anthony Stabile's family, watching Goodfellas must have been surreal and painful. There was their murdered relative portrayed on screen, his name spoken by the character based on the man who had betrayed him. His life reduced to a few scenes in a Hollywood production, and there was Henry Hill alive and prosperous and famous, having suffered no real consequences for his betrayal beyond the inconvenience of relocation. The moral complexity of Henry's story resists easy judgment. He betrayed his friends and violated the code he had sworn to uphold, but those friends would have killed him without hesitation if Burke had ordered it. And the code was a lie used to protect bosses while sacrificing soldiers. He cooperated with authorities and testified against criminals, helping to dismantle a violent organization, but he also committed serious crimes for decades and only cooperated when facing prison himself. Henry remained in the witness protection program off and on, and toured the country lecturing high school students not to lead the lifestyles of outlaws. Though the sincerity of this rehabilitation is questionable given his continued criminal activity and substance abuse, Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012, the day after his 69th birthday, from complications related to his long history of substance abuse. He had outlived virtually everyone from his crew: Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, Paul Vario, and Anthony Stabile, all long dead. The men who should have been his brothers, who he should have grown old with, had been murdered or died in prison while Henry lived on, protected by the very authorities he had spent his youth opposing. His obituary was carried by major newspapers around the world. He was remembered not for his crimes, but for his cooperation, not for the people he had helped kill, but for the stories he had told. The man who had violated every principle of mob life was mourned more publicly than the men who had died by the code. The ultimate irony: Henry Hill, the rat, the informant, the betrayer, achieved immortality. His story was told in books and films, analyzed by scholars. Consumed by millions, Anthony Stabile, who kept his mouth shut, who stayed loyal, who died by the code, was reduced to a footnote in Henry's story, a supporting character in someone else's narrative. To understand why Anthony Stabile chose the path he did, why he remained loyal even when loyalty was clearly fatal, we must examine the psychological factors that draw men into organized crime and keep them there even as it destroys them. The seduction begins early, in childhood, when boys in neighborhoods like Sunnyside and Bensonhurst watch the wise guys walking their streets. These men are impeccably dressed, driving new cars, treated with deference by shopkeepers and fear by enemies. They seem to have everything that poverty denies: money, respect, power, freedom. For boys growing up in immigrant families, watching their fathers work brutal hours at menial jobs for minimal pay, the gangster lifestyle represents an alternative path. Education might lead nowhere. Schools in poor neighborhoods are often inadequate, and even graduates face limited opportunities. Legitimate work offers only the same grinding poverty their fathers endured, but the mob offers immediate respect, substantial money, and membership in something larger than oneself. The recruitment process is gradual and subtle. A neighborhood kid might start by running errands for wise guys, bringing coffee, delivering messages, keeping lookout. These small services are rewarded with cash and attention from men who represent success. The boy learns that pleasing these men brings rewards, that being useful to the organization has value. As the boy ages, the assignments become more serious. Perhaps he participates in a hijacking, or helps with a robbery, or delivers packages containing illegal goods. Each successful completion bonds him more tightly to the organization, makes him more complicit, reduces his options for leaving. By the time he's a young man, his entire identity is wrapped up in being a mobster. It's not just what he does, it's who he is. The psychological bonds are reinforced through constant social interaction. The crew spends enormous amounts of time together, creating relationships that feel like family, in many ways more intimate than actual family, because they're based on shared danger and shared secrets. These men have your back, or so the mythology suggests. They understand you in ways that civilians never could. They're your brothers. This sense of brotherhood is powerful and seductive. Humans are tribal creatures who crave belonging and acceptance. The mob provides both in abundance, along with clear hierarchies that give structure to life and clear rules that define appropriate behavior. For men who might otherwise feel lost in the chaos of modern life, organized crime provides purpose and meaning. The Code of Omerta, the vow of silence, is presented as a point of honor, the characteristic that separates men from rats. You don't cooperate with authorities no matter what. You do your time if arrested. You never testify against your associates. This code is framed as being about loyalty and honor, about being a man of principle who keeps his word. The reality, of course, is that Omerta primarily benefits those at the top of the hierarchy. Bosses and captains are protected by the silence of their subordinates, who go to prison rather than testifying. The code ensures that evidence flows downward. Soldiers get arrested, while bosses remain free, and that liability is contained at the lowest levels possible. But for someone like Anthony Stabile, the code wasn't a cynical tool. It was a genuine belief system. He had internalized the mythology, believed that loyalty had inherent value, trusted that following the rules would earn protection and respect, even as evidence mounted that the code was selectively enforced and primarily served to protect bosses. Anthony continued to believe this psychological commitment to a belief system, even when it clearly contradicts reality, is not unique to mobsters. Religious believers maintain faith despite contrary evidence. Political partisans defend their chosen party despite obvious corruption. Abused spouses return to their abusers. Humans have an enormous capacity for cognitive dissonance, for maintaining contradictory beliefs, for rationalizing choices even when those choices are clearly destructive. The violence in mob life also requires psychological adaptation. Most humans have a strong aversion to killing other people. It violates deep evolutionary programming that promotes cooperation and social bonding. Soldiers in warfare often fire their weapons without aiming to kill. And combatants who do kill often suffer psychological trauma afterward. Mobsters overcome this aversion through several mechanisms. First, they dehumanize their victims. The person they're killing is a rat, an enemy, someone who violated the code, someone who deserves what's coming. Second, they frame violence as necessary business, no different than any other unpleasant task that has to be completed. Third, they rely on group psychology when multiple people participate in a murder. Individual responsibility feels diminished. Additionally, successful mobsters learn to compartmentalize. They can be brutal killers in one context and loving fathers in another, maintaining separate psychological spaces that don't communicate. This compartmentalization allows them to commit acts that would otherwise cause overwhelming guilt and shame. The gambling addiction that characterized many mobsters, including Anthony, served psychological functions beyond mere entertainment. The action, the adrenaline rush of risking substantial money on uncertain outcomes, mimicked the excitement of criminal operations. It provided a legal outlet for the same impulses that drove them to robbery and theft. Moreover, gambling addiction created perpetual financial need that justified continued criminal activity. A mobster who made $100,000 from a hijacking, but lost $180,000 gambling, had to immediately start planning the next score. This cycle of earning and losing kept him locked into the lifestyle, never quite getting ahead enough to retire, always needing that next big score. The cult-like aspects of mob life shouldn't be understated. Like religious cults, organized crime provides a complete worldview, a total identity, an all-consuming lifestyle that leaves little room for outside influences. Members are encouraged to socialize primarily with other members, to adopt the organization's values and perspectives, to view outsiders with suspicion. Leaving is presented as impossible, not just because bosses won't permit it, but because there's nowhere to go. Your entire identity is wrapped up in being a mobster. Your skills are crime-specific and non-transferable. Your social circle consists entirely of criminals. Your family knows you're a gangster and might be dependent on your criminal income. Where would you go? What would you do? Who would you be? This psychological entrapment is perhaps the cruelest aspect of mob life. By the time men like Anthony Stabile realized that the life wasn't what it promised, that loyalty wasn't rewarded, that the code was a lie, they were so deeply embedded that escape was effectively impossible. They were trapped by their own choices, by their psychological investments, by the bridges they had burned and the crimes they had committed, and so they continued even as friends died around them, even as evidence mounted that the life led nowhere good, even as their survival depended on luck more than skill. They continued because they didn't know how to stop, because their identities were bound to the organization, because admitting that they had wasted their lives on a lie was too painful to contemplate. Anthony Stabile died as he lived loyal to a code that didn't protect him, faithful to an organization that saw him as expendable. Believing in principles that existed only in mythology, his psychological commitment to mob life, his inability or unwillingness to see it for what it really was, ultimately killed him as surely as the bullet to his head. And that's the true story of Anthony Stabile, the gangster who lived in the shadows, died in the flames, and was immortalized on screen. A man caught between two crime families, loyal to a fault, and ultimately destroyed by the very world he dedicated his life to serving. If this story kept you captivated, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what you think about Anthony's fate. And make sure you're subscribed, because we've got so many more untold gangster stories coming your way. Share this video with anyone who loves true crime, mob history, or just a powerful story. And remember, the mob life might look glamorous in the movies, but in reality, it always ends the same way: prison, poverty, or a bullet. Thanks for spending your time with me tonight. Now get some sleep if you can. Sweet dreams. And I'll see you in the next one.